Imagine waking up in the dark, not because it's early, but because the sun never reaches your home. You're 7 years old, and already your day is measured not in hours, but in injuries. Your fingers are raw from spinning thread, your lungs burn from coal dust, and your stomach hasn't felt full in days. There are no toys, no birthdays, no school books. Just the factory bell, just the foreman's cane, just the unshakable knowledge that no one, not your boss, not your government, not even your family, will stop the machine to ask how you feel. This was not rare. This was reality for millions of children during the Industrial Revolution. And while history likes to tell stories about steam engines and steel empires, we here to tell the story it left out, the story of the children who powered it, and how the world chewed them up in the name of progress. Because before child labor was outlawed, wasn't just hard. It sucked. If you believe history should be honest, raw, human, and brutally real, then you're in the right place. Hit like if this story matters to you, and subscribe to Sleepless Historian so you don't miss the stories that textbooks forgot. Because the past isn't dead. It's just buried. Let's dig it up, together. To be born poor during the Industrial Revolution was not to be born into a childhood at all. It was to enter the world through a doorway of soot. Your very first breath, taken in a dark, damp room overcrowded with bodies, was probably a gasp laced with coal dust, factory smoke, and the stale stench of unwashed skin. You weren't laid in a cradle. If you were lucky, you were wrapped in rags and placed on a straw mat in the corner of a room shared with half your family. If you were unlucky, and many were, you were born on the floor of a slum tenement where rats scurried openly and mothers wiped your face with the edge of a skirt already stiff with grime. The place you called home was usually just one room, not one bedroom, one room, windowless, airless, damp. A single fireplace for warmth, if it worked. Wooden boards that groaned beneath your feet, sometimes rotting through in patches, and walls so thin you could hear your neighbors breathe. Privacy was non-existent, sleep was communal. Siblings, parents, and sometimes unrelated boarders all curled up like spoons to conserve body heat. Some rooms had more people in them than square feet. Many children were born in such cramped quarters that mothers had to labor between buckets, while older siblings were told to face the wall or not look. And outside? It didn't get better. The streets weren't paved with cobblestone dreams, but with human waste and filth. Factory towns had boomed too fast for city planners to catch up. Rows upon rows of brick housing, back-to-backs, were thrown up quickly, with no sewage systems, no drainage, and no sunlight. Narrow alleys were packed so tight with buildings, you could reach across and touch the wall of your neighbor's home. Children like you grew up never seeing the sky as blue. The smoke from nearby chimneys, thousands of them, formed a constant haze, thick enough that some towns were permanently dim, even at midday. Open gutters ran between buildings, often carrying human excrement and factory runoff through the streets. In wealthier parts of town, children walked with nannies in tailored coats. But here, in your world, children went barefoot, their feet blackened with soot, cut by glass, or frostbitten from long winters. Rickets, caused by a lack of sunlight and nutrition, bent the legs of toddlers. Pot bellies, infected eyes, and hacking coughs were so common that they weren't seen as illnesses anymore. They were seen as signs of a normal child. Water came from shared street pumps, if they worked. If not, families collected it from puddles, canals, or rain barrels teeming with disease. Clean drinking water was a fantasy. Cholera and typhoid were regular visitors. Whole neighborhoods would lose half their children in a month, and still no one cleaned the water supply. It wasn't that they didn't care. It's that they didn't consider it worth fixing. Working class children weren't seen as future citizens. They were seen as future workers, or more bluntly, temporary fuel. The air you breathed was poison, not in a metaphorical sense, literally. Factories belched smoke from morning to night. Chimneys pumped coal ash, sulfur, and powdered chemicals into the sky. In mining towns, black soot settled over the rooftops like snowfall. White sheets hung out to dry came back gray. Children inhaled this mix daily. Bronchitis, asthma, and what doctors then called consumption infected lungs by age 5. No one wore masks. No one gave out medicine. You just coughed and kept coughing until your chest collapsed in on itself. And through all this, no one stopped to ask what it felt like to be a child. You were not protected. You were not nurtured. You were not raised. You were endured. Parents, often both working long shifts in factories or mills, had no time to soothe you. Older siblings became stand-in parents. Babies were left unattended for hours. Toddlers crawled unsupervised across uneven stone, sometimes right into open gutters. A slip, a disease, or a freak accident could take your life, and if it did, you were mourned with silence. Not because you weren't loved, but because grief was a luxury the poor couldn't afford. Some families shared homes with livestock, pigs, goats, chickens, all cramped into the same room to save money. Others took in lodgers just to cover rent, further shrinking your already limited space. A single fireplace had to heat the room and cook whatever meal, if any, your family could manage. There were days when dinner was nothing but weak tea and a slice of bread. Some weeks, not even that. Hunger became a second shadow. Your stomach growled so often that silence began to sound like suffering. Even your clothes told the world your worth. You didn't own a wardrobe. You had one set of clothes, usually handed down and patched a dozen times. Shoes were a rare possession. Many children walked barefoot through winter snow and summer cobblestones alike. Head lice, fleas, and skin infections were constant. Children scratched themselves raw and slept in rags that barely held together. Soap, when it was available, was often saved for Sunday, if only for show. These streets did not welcome childhood, they ate it. Dames existed, but they were built from scraps, a stick, a rock, a hoop from a broken barrel. Laughter still happened, it had to, but always under the looming shadow of exhaustion. Older boys might chase each other between buildings, only to be shouted down by a factory foreman or street vendor who saw them as pests. If you loitered too long in the wrong alley, you risked being pulled into a job, a gang, or worse. There was no safety net. There was no neighborhood watch. There was only survival, and if you made it to 10, you'd already outlived thousands. Inside your home, violence was never far away. Fathers, embittered by long hours and low pay, often drank themselves into numbness. Domestic violence against wives, against children, was common and rarely punished. Neighbors heard it through the walls but said nothing. Beatings were considered discipline. Screaming was background noise. Boys learned early to duck. Girls learned early to disappear. Mothers bore the stress of both work and parenting, often returning from the mill only to find the youngest child feverish and the eldest missing. And still, the system blamed you. Reformers, politicians, even newspapers often painted working-class children as dirty, dishonest, or dangerous. The problem, they said, was not the poverty you were born into, it was your character. This logic justified their inaction. If the child was born wicked, then suffering was just a consequence, and if you died, there would be no plaque, no burial plot with a headstone. Most poor children were buried in mass graves, their names forgotten, their memories folded into the bricks of the city they helped build. It is important to understand, none of this was inevitable. The wealth that poured out of the factories and mills of 18th and 19th century cities funded massive empires, built grand railways, and filled the homes of the rich with luxuries. But it did not trickle down. It did not reach you. It did not build your school, fix your street, or feed your family. It bought more machines. It built bigger factories. It turned your city into an engine, and you were just a cog. So yes, this is where your childhood begins, Not in a schoolroom or a storybook, but in a rented room choked with smoke. Outside your door, the street is alive with rats and shouting, your lungs already aching, your stomach already hollow. The factory waits, the mine waits, the chimney waits. Childhood for you is not a time of becoming. It's a time of breaking, and the breaking has already begun. Before your first steps, before your first words, before you even understand the world around you, one thing is already certain. You are sick. In the slums of the Industrial Revolution, disease wasn't a threat on the horizon. It was your very first playmate. You learned its name before you knew your father's. It came into your home not with screams or sirens, but with a rattle in the lungs, a dull ache in the gut, or a red rash that no one could afford to treat. And if you were born into a working-class family in a place like Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, or the soot-blackened boroughs of London, there was almost no escape. Illness didn't visit your childhood. It was your childhood. The walls of your home were damp, not metaphorically, but literally oozing. Slum tenements, built quickly to house the exploding urban population, had no ventilation and no insulation. Rain leaked through cracked rooftops. Cold air crept in through gaps in the brickwork. Your home was a breeding ground for mold and mildew, and the air you inhaled while you slept, usually inches from the floor, was laced with spores. By the time you were 6 months old, your lungs were already losing the fight. Coughing fits were nightly, and sometimes you woke up gasping, your tiny chest heaving in panic. But there were no inhalers, no antibiotics, no nebulizers humming in the background. You were simply left to cough and cry, and if the gods were kind, to recover. The most common killer of infants and toddlers in industrial cities was diarrhea. It sounds benign by today's standards, but in 19th century working-class England, it was often a death sentence. With contaminated water, rotten food, no sanitation, and zero understanding of germ theory, bacterial infections ripped through the bodies of children like wildfires. Infants, especially those not breastfed due to maternal labor demands, were fed watered-down cow's milk stored in unclean containers. Milk spoiled quickly, especially in summer, and without refrigeration, it was often crawling with bacteria by the time it reached a baby's mouth. One meal could turn into a fever. One fever could turn into a grave. And where did the water come from? Public pumps, mostly, if they were operational. The same water that had been used to wash bloody butcher tools, rinse out chamber pots, or flush waste down open drains. Water was often fetched in shared buckets, carried through alleys lined with animal waste and factory runoff. Contamination wasn't just common, it was inevitable. In fact, cholera epidemics were so frequent in major cities that they became background noise. From 1832 to 1866, waves of cholera swept through Britain, killing tens of thousands. And it wasn't just adults. Children died in droves. One day, a child was playing in the yard. The next, they were vomiting uncontrollably and convulsing on the floor. Hours later, they were gone. It happened that fast. Measles, scarlet fever, and smallpox were equally ruthless. They swept through the slums in cycles, infecting nearly every child at some point in their life. Vaccination was still in its infancy, poorly distributed, and often met with suspicion or resistance. Many poor families didn't know it existed, couldn't afford it, or simply had no access to doctors who could administer it. If one child in a tenement block caught measles, the infection would spread to dozens more within days. There was no quarantine, no sick leave, no school nurse. If you survived, it was only because your immune system had endured a trial by fire. Tuberculosis, then called consumption, was another lifelong stalker. It didn't just kill children, it drained them slowly. You could live for months, even years, with the hollow cough, the flushed cheeks, the constant fatigue. And all the while your body wasted away. Many children caught TB from their parents or from other children in their crowded housing blocks. There was no medicine, no rest, no recovery period. You still went to work. You still dragged your feet to the factory floor or down the dark alleyways with a basket of coal, coughing blood into a rag and pretending you were fine. Because if you didn't, your family didn't eat. Poor nutrition didn't just leave children vulnerable to illness, it guaranteed it. Working class diets were built around white bread, potatoes, and weak tea. If you were lucky, there might be a spoonful of lard or margarine to spread on your bread, or a piece of boiled cabbage to stretch a meal. Protein, meat, eggs, dairy was rare, expensive, and often reserved for the man of the house. Milk, when available, was watered down to save cost. Fruit was a luxury. The result: children suffered from rickets, a bone-softening disease caused by severe vitamin D deficiency. By the time you learned to walk, your legs were often bowed inward, your joints swollen and painful. You might have to crawl longer than normal simply because your bones were too weak to carry your body weight. And there were other, quieter killers, ones that left no rash, no cough, but ravaged nonetheless. Whooping cough, or pertussis, was a constant threat. In infants, the fits could cause unconsciousness or even death. Diphtheria, another now rare disease, was once a leading cause of death for children. It inflamed the throat until it swelled shut. Children died gasping in their mother's arms, unable to swallow water or even breathe. Again, no hospital, no ambulance, no sterile rooms. Just screaming in the darkness and the slow, quiet silence of death. When a child died, there was rarely a proper burial. Many were laid to rest in mass pauper graves, unmarked and unmourned in any official sense. Some families sold the child's clothes to pay for the funeral. Others couldn't afford even that. Death notices cost money. Grief, like everything else, was taxed. The infant mortality rate among the urban poor in the early 1800s hovered between 30 to 50% in many areas. That meant if you gave birth to 4 children, you might only raise 2. And even then, you couldn't relax, because disease didn't stop at age 5. It simply changed its tactics. Mothers often bore the guilt of these deaths silently. With both parents usually working brutal hours, infants were left in the care of older siblings or, more commonly, paid baby minders. Older women who looked after multiple children at once for pennies a week. These minders had no training, no medical knowledge, and often no patience. Babies were sometimes drugged with Godfrey's cordial or other opiate-laced syrups to keep them quiet. In small doses, the syrup bought peace and sleep. In large doses, it bought stillness, forever. Doctors, if consulted at all, offered little hope. Medical care was a luxury of the middle and upper classes. Working class families might pool resources to see a local apothecary or rely on folk remedies. Bloodletting, leeches, mustard plasters, and camphor were among the common treatments, many of which did more harm than good. Hospitals were places of last resort, often regarded with fear. They were overcrowded, underfunded, and filled with the cries of people dying in pain. For a poor child, getting sent to a hospital was less a chance at recovery than a sentence of abandonment. Even the sounds of sickness filled your daily life. You woke to the coughing of your siblings, the wheeze of your father trying to breathe after a night shift in the mines. You heard the groans of neighbors through the walls, some sobbing in fever dreams, others choking on bile. You could smell it too, the acidic scent of vomit, the iron tang of blood-stained cloth, the sweet rot of infected wounds. These were the lullabies of the industrial age. What makes it worse? What makes it unbearable, in hindsight, is that none of this was necessary. These were not divine punishments, they were man-made. They were the product of industrial negligence, political indifference, and a cultural system that viewed working-class lives as expendable. The technology existed to provide clean water. The money existed to build real housing. The science was emerging that could explain disease transmission, but the will? That was always missing. To be a child in the Industrial Revolution was to be sick, constantly, helplessly, often fatally. You didn't learn to walk before you learned to wheeze. You didn't speak before you coughed. And by the time your body grew strong enough to survive, your soul had already been broken by pain. And the worst part, no one was keeping track. No one was counting how many of you died. Because in the machinery of empire, you weren't a child. You were just another name that never made the record books. Before you even understand the value of money, your family understands your value as money. You are born not as a future scholar, artist, or dreamer, but as a future laborer, a living coin in a household purse that is almost always empty. In the Industrial Revolution, the working poor lived on a knife's edge. Wages were unpredictable, inflation constant, and costs always just a little higher than last month. For families living in slum tenements and alleyside hovels, there was no saving for the future. There was only surviving the week. And when another mouth to feed arrived, the solution was already understood. That mouth must earn its keep. Your parents didn't send you to work out of cruelty. They did it out of desperation. Most working-class families had no choice. A man's wage, earned through exhausting shifts in a mine, a textile mill, or a metal foundry, was rarely enough to support even himself. A woman's wage, if she could find work at all, was lower still, often half that of a man doing the same job. And remember, these were not salaries with health benefits or paid leave. These were daily wages, sometimes hourly, docked for lateness, mistakes, illness, or cruelly for things outside your control, like the machines breaking down or materials running short. So when you were born, your future had already been penciled in. As soon as you were old enough to walk without falling and lift something heavier than a doll, you would go to work. For many, that meant starting as young as 5 or 6. Not because you were ready, but because your family's rent was due. Because your baby brother needed food. Because your father had coughed blood into a rag and missed a day at the mill. In those moments, you weren't the child. You were the extra income. There was no welfare state, no unemployment benefit, no child allowance. The state did not support the poor. If anything, it punished them. The poor laws in Britain were designed not to help the destitute, but to discourage dependence. If your family applied for relief, they might be sent to the workhouse, a prison-like institution where families were separated, stripped of dignity, and fed barely enough to survive. So instead of seeking help, families turned inward. Every able body, no matter how small, became a breadwinner. Work was often found through word of mouth or through factory. Overlookers, mid-level foremen who scouted children from the neighborhood. If your father already worked at the mill, he might bring you with him. Or he might apprentice you out, not in the hopeful sense of learning a trade, but in the grim arrangement where you were bound to an employer in exchange for food, shelter, and tiny wages. Sometimes this was formalized. More often, it was just an understanding. I'll take your boy off your hands, and he'll sweep the floors for 6 pence a week. The factory owners, of course, welcomed this. Children were perfect workers. They were obedient, desperate to please, and most importantly, cheap. You could pay a child 1/3 or 1/4 of a man's wage and still get 12 hours of labor. Children also had smaller hands, which made them ideal for delicate or dangerous work. Cleaning inside running machines, sorting threads, crawling under spinning mules, or climbing narrow chimneys. If they got injured, which was common, they were easy to replace. And if they died, there were no lawsuits, no labor boards, no headlines, just silence. Many families justified child labor with a simple logic. The child is helping the family. And in a narrow, brutal sense, they were right. Without that extra income, some families couldn't afford rent or bread. In some households, The wages of children accounted for 30 to 50% of the total income. A single child might earn enough in a week to keep the whole family from starving, even if that wage was pitiful by modern standards. But this logic, born from desperation, came at a cost. Children who worked full-time jobs did not attend school. They missed years, sometimes lifetimes, of education. The first few generations of industrial working-class children were largely illiterate. They learned numbers only through pay ledgers and pricing signs. They couldn't read newspapers or books. They couldn't write letters. They couldn't envision a life outside the factory because they had never seen one. Their world was a spinning wheel, a coal cart, a furnace, a loom. Even among those few who did attend school part-time, exhaustion was a barrier. After a 12-hour shift, it was hard to stay awake through reading lessons. Some schools for the poor operated in the evening, but many children nodded off at their desks, their heads sliding sideways until the teacher rapped their knuckles with a rod. There was no compassion for fatigue. Laziness was blamed on poor breeding, not overwork. Boys were whipped for daydreaming. Girls were scolded for slouching. And eventually, many just stopped going. The psychological cost was immense. A child who starts working at 6 is robbed not just of education, but of identity. Your life becomes a blur of repetition. Wake up before dawn. Walk in the dark to the factory. Work until your hands blister. Eat lunch if you're allowed. Work again. Walk home. Collapse. Repeat. There's no time for imagination, no space for wonder. You don't play, except maybe in the cracks between shifts. You don't build forts or make up stories. You exist to earn nothing more. Your parents knew this, and many hated it. There are accounts of mothers weeping as they dressed their children for their first day of factory work. Fathers who gave away their lunch so a child could eat, but love had no power against poverty. A parent's affection couldn't pay the landlord or stop a baby's fever, so they hardened themselves. They told you to be brave, to work hard, to not cry. And you listened because you had no other choice. It's easy to look back with judgment. Why didn't parents protect their children? Why didn't they rebel? But such questions miss the point. These were families trapped in a system designed to exploit them. Industrial capitalism, in its rawest form, demanded labor at the lowest possible cost. And children, tragically, were the cheapest labor of all. Every reform that came later, the Factory Acts, the Education Acts, the child labor bans, came only after decades of suffering. They were paid for in broken backs, stunted growth, and childhoods lost to machines. In the 1830s and 1840s, early reformers began documenting the realities of child labor. Their reports shocked the upper classes, children chained to machines, working in pitch darkness, coughing blood by age 10. Artists drew etchings of skeletal boys hauling coal, of girls with bandaged hands and hollow eyes. These images stirred public outrage, but not enough to stop the system overnight. Factory owners lobbied fiercely against regulations. Many claimed children wanted to work, that it taught them discipline, that it kept them out of trouble, and so the machine ground on. Parents kept sending their children to work, not because they believed in it, but because they were held hostage by it. In a world with no support systems, no safety nets, and no alternatives, child labor wasn't a moral failure. It was a survival tactic, a horrible, heartbreaking calculation made daily by people with no good options. So now, imagine yourself again, 6 years old, eyes still sleepy, stomach rumbling. Your mother ties your coat, if you have one. Your father says nothing. You leave the house before the sun rises. Your little boots crunch over frozen mud. The sky is gray. The factory bell rings in the distance. Another day begins. You are not a child. You are a wage. To a child born into the grinding machinery of the Industrial Revolution, the word home meant something far different than what the word implies today. Home was not safety, home was not warmth, home was not where you went to rest. It was where you went to survive if you were lucky. And if you weren't, it was the place that wore you down faster than the factory ever could. It wasn't the place you looked forward to after work. It was the place you dreaded returning to because it reminded you of everything you didn't have. Picture it. Your home is a single room, maybe two, if your family is fortunate or if an older sibling has died recently, freeing up space. The floor is dirt or wood so warped and splintered that it creaks under every step. Walls are cracked and damp, seeping with moisture that never dries, even in summer. There's no insulation, no paint. Just bare brick, sometimes covered with old rags to keep the cold from creeping in. And the smell, it hits you like a slap. Coal smoke, spoiled food, chamber pot fumes, sweat, and sickness all mingling into one stagnant, choking stench. This was not an uncommon home. In the worst parts of cities like Manchester, Liverpool, or Glasgow, entire families, 5, 6, even 10 people, were crammed into rooms no bigger than a modern bathroom. The tenement blocks were built fast and cheap to meet the insatiable demand for housing near the factories. No regard was given to ventilation, light, or safety. Buildings were erected wall to wall, cramming as many lives as possible into as little space as the law would tolerate, and often less than that. In some back-to-back houses, there were no windows at all. Light came from a single candle, and air came only when the door was opened. The furniture was minimal and always secondhand. A table, perhaps. A few wooden stools. A sagging bed frame shared by 3 or 4 children, while parents might sleep on a mat on the floor or a pile of sacks stuffed with straw. There were no wardrobes or closets, just hooks on the wall or a trunk where clothes were stuffed in and forgotten. Everything smelled like damp wool and unwashed skin. Rats made homes in the cracks behind the fireplace. Cockroaches crawled freely. In some homes, children slept beside chickens or goats, brought inside to prevent theft or for the faint warmth of their bodies. There was rarely a toilet, certainly not inside. Most families shared a communal privy with several other households. These were outdoor brick sheds with a wooden plank in a hole, emptied occasionally by night soilmen who collected waste under cover of darkness. If the privy overflowed, and it often did, it leaked into the yard, down the walls, sometimes even under your door. Children got used to stepping over sewage on their way out the front door. In bad winters, the waste froze in place. In summer, it festered in the heat. Water was just as grim. Few homes had running water. You fetched it from a public pump or a fountain, water that was often polluted by the same runoff from the privies or nearby factories. Buckets were shared by multiple families, and the act of bringing water home was a daily ritual, even for children. That water was used for everything: drinking, cooking, washing dishes, scrubbing floors, and bathing. By the time it reached the final task, a child's bath, it was often dark and lukewarm, swirled with flecks of food or soot. And that's if you got a bath at all. Most children were lucky to be washed once a week, Sunday night in a tin basin in the corner of the room. Soap was expensive and hot water cost coal. Families had to choose, cook food or clean your children. Some tried to do both. Most failed. Skin diseases like impetigo, scabies, and lice were rampant. Girls scratched their scalps raw. Boys rubbed dirt into their sores, hoping the itching would stop. It rarely did. When people speak about Victorian morality or family values, they picture lace curtains and tea sets. But in your home, there were no parlor games or hymn singing. There was silence or shouting. Constant stress weighed down every adult in the room. Fathers who worked 14-hour days came home broken. Their hands were blistered, their backs hunched, their lungs wheezing from the mine or the mill. They had nothing left to give. Mothers worked equally long hours in textile factories, laundries, or doing piecework at home, sewing buttons until their fingers bled under candlelight. The moment she walked through the door, your mother wasn't greeted with smiles. She was met with a pile of dishes, 2 sick children, and a baby who hadn't stopped crying since morning. This stress often boiled over into violence. Domestic abuse was epidemic in slum homes, not because the people were naturally cruel, but because poverty reduced everyone to their ugliest selves. With no access to therapy, no social services, no pause button, pain was passed down from adult to child like a family heirloom. A father hit his son not because he wanted to, but because he had been hit, because he had been humiliated all day by his boss, because no one respected him anywhere else. It wasn't right, it wasn't excusable, but it was real. For many children, home was not a sanctuary from the world. It was just another place to flinch. And yet, even amid the darkness, there were sparks of care, a mother's touch, worn but gentle, a shared crust of bread between siblings. A lullaby hummed softly in the dark, not to lull the child to sleep, but to calm the singer's own exhausted heart. These were fleeting moments, flashes of what home could have meant, but they were always at risk of being drowned by the tide of poverty lapping at the door. There were no toys in your home. If you had one, a carved wooden figure, a tin soldier, a rag doll, it was treasured like gold. Most children improvised. A piece of string became a whip, a broken spoon became a doll, a lump of coal became a toy car. Play was a privilege squeezed between chores. Girls helped sweep the floor or stir soup at the stove. Boys might help carry water or fetch coal. Infants were rocked by older siblings barely able to walk themselves. Childhood roles were not age-based but need-based. If you could help, you did. The concept of bedtime barely existed. People slept when work was done, which was often late into the night. Candlelight was precious and expensive, so most families sat in darkness. Children might fall asleep to the sound of a sewing needle tapping cloth or their father coughing into the firelight. There were no bedtime stories, no goodnight kisses. Just sleep, interrupted often by rats, or the cold, or the crying of the baby. When you woke up, it was dark again, and the cycle began anew. In winter, the cold seeped into every corner. Children sometimes wore their coats to bed, if they had them. Families huddled together like animals, layering every rag and cloth they owned into makeshift blankets. Fingers turned blue, toes lost feeling. Some children simply didn't wake up. They weren't mourned with flowers or songs. There was no money for that. The body was wrapped in old cloth, and if a priest could be found, a few words were said. Then life went on, and still people called it home. Not because it was warm, not because it was safe, but because it was all they had. A child growing up in such a place might never know comfort, but they knew what was theirs. That corner of the room, that creaky stool, that chipped mug, it belonged to them. In a world where nothing was secure, where wages could vanish and siblings could die, ownership of anything was a rare and priceless thing. So when someone asks, what did home mean to a child during the Industrial Revolution? This is the truth. It meant a space barely large enough to hold your breath. It meant a ceiling that dripped, a floor that froze, and a bed you shared with a coughing brother and a sleepless sister. It meant hunger in the kitchen, darkness in the hallway, and illness on the mattress, but it also meant endurance. Because no matter how bleak, how broken, or how unbearable that room was, it was the only place where someone might still call your name with love. You wake up long before the sun even thinks about rising. The room is still black, the fire long dead. The only heat is the body of your little brother next to you, still curled in the same position he collapsed into the night before. You don't stretch. You don't yawn. There's no leisure to it. You just move slowly because everything hurts. Your back aches, your fingers are stiff, and your feet are still blistered from the day before. You haven't had a day off in weeks, and you won't have one for many more to come. You're a child, but not by the standards of your time. In the Industrial Revolution, childhood wasn't defined by age, it was defined by labor. The moment you could walk upright and follow instructions, you were a candidate for the factory floor. If you were small enough to fit between the machinery, you were prized. If you had enough stamina to last a 12 or 14-hour shift, you were valuable. If not, you were a burden. There was no in-between. You eat whatever your mother hands you as you rush out the door, maybe a crust of bread, maybe nothing. Tea if you're lucky, watered down, never sweetened. You walk through frozen streets before the city stirs. The only ones awake at this hour are the workers and the rats. You see other children on the road, heading the same way. No one talks, it's too early. You trudge together like ghosts, huddled in tattered coats, scarves wrapped tight around your noses to keep out the stink of last night's chimney smoke. When you arrive at the factory, it looms above you, a red brick monster taller than any church you've ever seen. Its chimneys are already belching thick clouds into the sky, turning the morning darker than it already was. Inside, the overseers are waiting. They don't greet you. They don't ask how your night was. You're lined up, inspected, and sent to your stations. The machines are already running. They're always running. They never stop. Not for you, not for anyone. Your job depends on the factory. If you're in a cotton mill, you might be a scavenger, crawling under spinning machines to pick up loose lint or thread. You do this while the machines are on, mind you. They never turn them off for cleaning. Downtime costs money. You duck beneath steel arms, whipping back and forth inches from your skull, praying your sleeves don't get caught. If they do, your arm might be torn clean off before anyone notices. And even if they notice, it's too late. You'll be blamed for the accident. If you're a piecer, you lean over machines, tying together broken threads with raw, red fingers. You do this hundreds of times an hour, your eyes straining in low light. If you're in a coal mine, you're a trapper boy. Your job is to sit in pitch darkness for 12 hours, opening and closing a wooden door whenever a coal cart comes rumbling through. You're alone. Entire shifts spent in silence, broken only by the distant crash of picks and the wheeze of your own lungs as coal dust settles into them forever. And if you're a chimney sweep, then your workday begins with pain. You're shoved up into a flue barely wider than your shoulders, scraping away soot with your fingers and a metal brush. You cough, you gag, your knees bleed, and if you get stuck, as many small children did, your master drags you out by the legs, sometimes breaking ribs in the process. Some never come out. Their names vanish, but their skeletons are found decades later, curled into soot-stained silence. There are no breaks. There's no lunch hour. There is a window, maybe 30 minutes, when you re-allowed to eat what little you brought, usually sitting on a crate, the roar of machines still echoing in your ears, the smell of oil and heat turning your stomach. You eat with filthy hands because there's no place to wash them, and then you're back to it. Hour after hour, the work grinds on. Your muscles ache, your bones groan, your head throbs from the unending noise. The noise is indescribable. Hundreds of machines clanking, hissing, pounding in rhythm. Your ears ring constantly. Children often went deaf within a few years. You learn to read lips, to respond to shouted commands, to flinch whenever the overseer's stick comes near. Because yes, there's violence. If you fall behind, you get whipped. If you spill something, slapped. If you show fatigue, punished. Overseers are paid to maintain productivity, not morale. You're not alone in this. The factory is filled with children like you. Some are younger. Some are so small they need to stand on boxes to reach the machines. The older ones have the eyes of adults, hollow, tired, unblinking. Injuries are common: crushed fingers, broken limbs, scalps torn from heads when hair gets caught in gears. There's no nurse, no first aid. Maybe someone wraps a rag around it. Maybe they carry you home, but more often you're expected to keep working. Why don't you cry? Sometimes you do quietly at first, but it stops. Crying takes energy, and energy is a luxury. You learn to swallow pain the same way you swallow stale bread, without tasting it, without thinking, without complaint. The shift ends after 12, sometimes 14 hours. There's no celebration, no whistle signaling freedom, just the mechanical decrescendo of the machine slowing down, the momentary silence as the belts come to a stop. You don't cheer, you don't run. You just file out, dragging your feet, ears ringing, eyes burning from the dust. You walk home in the dark, just like you walk to work. Sometimes it's raining, sometimes it's snowing. It doesn't matter. You can't afford a carriage. Your boots are worn thin. Your hands tremble from strain. You're hungry, but there's rarely enough food. Maybe a stew, maybe potatoes, maybe nothing. And tomorrow, you'll do it again. There are no weekends, no holidays. Sunday is your only pause, and even then, it's usually spent preparing for Monday. The Lord's Day offers a few hours of stillness, but by the time you reach adolescence, even that feels like a trick. You've aged faster than your years. You know things no child should know. What broken bones sound like. What blood tastes like when you bite your lip to stay quiet. What it feels like to see a friend lose a finger and keep working anyway. People speak of the Industrial Revolution with awe. The marvels of steam, the rise of mass production, the birth of the modern city. But they rarely talk about this, the children who paid for it with their bodies. Behind every spool of thread, every ton of coal, every polished floorboard was a child who had bled, starved, or broken to make it happen. And there were thousands, no millions of them. And if you dared to complain, to protest, there was always someone poorer, someone more desperate, willing to take your place. You weren't irreplaceable. You were expendable. You were fuel. That was your day. Every day. No rest, no school, no future. Just 12 hours of hurt stretched across the entirety of your childhood. It wasn't just that the work hurt, it's that it mangled you. There were no safe jobs in the Industrial Revolution, least of all for children. Every task, every corner, every tool was a threat. And what made it worse was the indifference, not just of the machine, but of the people who ran them. They didn't care. Not because they were monsters, but because the system had taught them that children were not really people. You were labor. You were expendable. If something happened to you, it was written off as part of the cost of doing business. You might think, as a child, that your size made you more nimble, more suited to delicate tasks. But in truth, your size made you vulnerable, dangerously so. Your arms were smaller, your fingers thinner, your heads lower to the ground. That meant you could squeeze between the moving belts, beneath the clattering looms, inside the crawl spaces of the cotton gins and spinning jennies. It also meant that when the machine turned, and it always did, it turned faster than you could react. Many children in textile factories were assigned to clean running machines, not clean when the machines stop. That would have meant stopping production. Instead, you cleaned them while they ran. You crawled beneath the looms and spinning frames, brushing out clumps of lint, retrieving fallen spindles, or tying broken threads with your bare fingers. These machines didn't pause, they didn't slow down, and they didn't care if your sleeve or braid got caught. One wrong movement, one slip, and the machine would grab you like a beast snapping its jaw shut. If you were lucky, it tore your shirt. If you weren't, it took your finger, your arm, your scalp. One girl, only 9 years old, was dragged into a machine by her hair while tying threads. By the time they shut it down, the skin had been ripped clean from her skull. She lived, but she never worked again and never left the house without a bonnet to cover the scars. Others were not so fortunate. Coal mines were no safer. Children worked as hurriers, pulling carts of coal through tunnels barely 2 feet high. Harnessed to the cart by a belt or chain around the waist, they crawled forward like beasts of burden, knees scraping against jagged rock, breathing in coal dust with every breath. The tunnels were dark, the ceilings low, and collapses were common. A sudden cave-in might kill a dozen children in seconds. If you were a trapper, your job was to sit alone in the pitch black for 12 hours, opening and closing ventilation doors. You were told not to sleep. If you did, gas built up. And gas meant explosions. You'd think the adults would protect you. But the system didn't reward protection, it punished it. Factory overseers had quotas to meet. Supervisors were paid for output, not for safety. If a child got injured, it wasn't seen as a failing of the factory. It was seen as the child's fault. You didn't watch where you were going. You didn't tie your sleeves up tightly enough. You didn't move fast enough. It didn't matter that you were 8 years old. It didn't matter that your arms were shaking from hunger. The machine didn't care, and neither did the man holding the ledger. In truth, most injuries weren't even recorded. There were no OSHA inspectors, no workplace safety protocols. If a child lost a finger, the injury might be wrapped up with a strip of old cloth, and the child told to walk it off. If the wound got infected, and they almost always did, it meant amputation if your family could afford the doctor. If not, it meant fever, sepsis, and a quiet death at home. Children who survived these injuries were rarely compensated. A few pennies, maybe a pat on the head. Maybe, if the boss was feeling generous, they'd be moved to an easier job. But usually, they were simply dismissed, too damaged to be useful anymore. And what did you do then? You weren't paid a pension. You didn't receive disability. You just stopped working, which meant your family lost your wage. And in a house where your few shillings meant the difference between food and starvation, that was catastrophic. Some children begged in the streets with their stumps wrapped in dirty rags. Others went into poor houses, separated from their parents, labeled as invalids. A few were sent to charity hospitals, where they were treated not with medicine but with sermons. Because poverty, after all, was considered a moral failing. The industrial landscape was littered with child casualties. In 1833, a parliamentary inquiry found that nearly half of child workers had been injured on the job. Fingers lost, hands mangled, backs permanently bent from lifting weights far too heavy for a developing spine, and these were just the physical injuries. There were mental ones too, the kind that left no bruises but scarred just as deeply. Imagine the terror of returning to the same machine that nearly killed you yesterday. Imagine standing in the same tunnel where a friend died in a gas explosion. Imagine being told that if you cried again, you'd be beaten for disrupting the line. Children didn't talk about their fear. They swallowed it like they swallowed the soot and the pain, but it stayed with them. Many suffered from what we now recognize as PTSD, sleeplessness, nightmares, sudden panic attacks. Of course, back then it was just called nerves, or worse, laziness. The accidents were so common that some factories kept coffins on site. Let that sink in. Not first aid kits, coffins, because they knew children would die, and they planned for it. The deaths were often explained away with cold euphemisms. Caught in the gearing, suffered an unfortunate entanglement, expired during operation. No liability, no justice. Just a note in the ledger and a quick burial in a pauper's grave. Sometimes the factory didn't even notify the parents. Children worked under false names or through intermediaries. One mother learned her son had died only when he failed to return home one night. She later found out he'd been crushed under a loom. The factory owner said it wasn't his responsibility to inform her. After all, the boy wasn't on the books. He was hired off the record. It would be a mistake to see these tragedies as mere relics of the past, as isolated horrors. They were systemic, built into the very architecture of the Industrial Revolution. The entire economic engine of Britain, and later, the The United States, Germany, Belgium, and beyond relied on the bodies of working-class children. Injuries weren't accidents. They were features. And the worst part, the children knew it. They knew that if they died, nothing would change, that no one would rally, that the factory would keep humming, the smoke would keep rising, and another child would take their place. Maybe their own sibling, maybe the neighbor boy, maybe you. So when people today look back at the industrial age with rose-colored glasses, marveling at its technological advances, its soaring railroads, and glittering exhibitions, remember what they stood on: a mountain of small, broken hands. A generation of children who were crushed, burned, blinded, and buried so that the gears of progress could keep turning. These weren't accidents. They were casualties, and the world didn't even blink. The most terrifying thing about your childhood isn't to just the pain. It is how little of your time you actually own. From the moment you open your eyes to the moment you collapse into sleep, your entire life is governed by the tick of someone else's clock. Not a clock on your wall, of course. You don't own one. You don't need one. Because everyone in your world already knows what time it is. Factory time, the boss's time. Time that moves only in one direction. Forward, grinding, unrelenting. Industrial time is not natural time. In the fields, the sun once told people when to wake and rest. Days began with dawn and ended with dusk. There were pauses when it rained, breaks when it snowed, rests on feast days or holy Sundays. But the Industrial Revolution obliterated that rhythm. Machines didn't care about the sun. Steam engines didn't care about weather. Once factories arrived, time wasn't something you followed. It was something that ruled you. You start your day when the factory bell rings, usually around 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock and if you're late, even by a few minutes, you're punished. Wages docked, a slap, a threat. Maybe you're turned away and lose a whole day's pay. Maybe you're allowed in, but publicly humiliated in front of the other children. Some factories had lateness boards, wooden slates with chalk marks showing who failed to arrive on time. Your name might be there every day if you have to walk miles in rain or snow, if your baby brother was sick and delayed you, or if you simply couldn't find your shoes in the dark. You learn quickly, time is not yours. Time belongs to the overseer, to the foreman, to the mechanical beat of the looms. Once the day begins, it doesn't stop. Every movement must be fast, precise, on schedule. There's no room for hesitation. The machines set the pace, thundering forward in rhythmic violence. If your hands move too slow, the machine gets jammed. If you pause to scratch your arm or look around, you fall behind. If you fall behind, someone else picks up your slack and resents you for it, or worse, they don't, and the whole line suffers. To keep you disciplined, factories often use strict timekeeping systems. Whistles, bells, and clocks were everywhere, not for your benefit, but for theirs. Some mills employed clock boys who patrolled the floor, noting workers who stopped moving or missed steps. Others issued tickets when you arrived: late ticket, early ticket, break violation ticket. These weren't warnings, they were financial punishments. A single tardy ticket might cost you an hour's wage. Too many, and you were dismissed. Just like that. And what of breaks? There were few. Perhaps a half hour for lunch, often unpaid. No tea breaks. No rest periods. If your job required standing, you stood the whole shift. If you were a piecer or a spinner, you were expected to walk dozens of miles in place each day, back and forth beside the looms, tying threads, dodging rods, avoiding belts. No one encouraged you to sit. Sitting meant slowing. Slowing meant disobedience. Disobedience meant punishment. Discipline in the factories was not abstract. It was physical. Children were hit for all sorts of infractions, speaking without permission, dropping materials, getting distracted, even sneezing near the product. Overseers carried canes or leather straps, often using them liberally. The beatings weren't gentle taps. They were hard, humiliating strikes meant to bruise both body and pride. Some children were forced to wear signs around their necks: idler, laggard, sloth. Others were made to stand in corners for hours, knees bent, arms raised, even after a full day of labor. Some factories developed ingenious tortures to instill discipline. At Quarry Bank Mill in England, weights were tied to the necks of slow-working boys, metal bars meant to pull their heads down and force better posture. At other mills, hanging stools were used, a child forced to sit suspended by ropes so their feet didn't touch the floor. It was painful, humiliating, and designed to break the will. These were not punishments for theft or rebellion. These were for working too slowly, for being children. And if you cried, that was weakness, more punishment. You were told to be strong, like the adults, but you weren't an adult. You were 7 or 9 or 12. You didn't even understand time in the way they did. You couldn't read the clocks hung high on the walls, but you felt time. You felt it in your bones, in the way your limbs ached after the 4th hour, in the way your stomach growled at exactly midday, even when there was no food, in the way your eyes drooped in the final hour of your shift, when your brain screamed to sleep, but the overseer screamed louder. Time even followed you home. You returned not to freedom, but to more clocks. Chores had to be done before sundown. Dinner, if any, was eaten quickly. There was no relaxation, only recovery. If you took too long to scrub your hands or stitch a torn garment, you might be scolded. If you didn't wake up early enough the next morning, you might miss the bell and lose the day. Some children slept in their work clothes to save time. Some kept pebbles in their shoes to force themselves to stay alert. This mechanical sense of time shaped your very mind. Your instincts became scheduled. You flinched at bells. You counted minutes by instinct. You feared the silence between factory sounds because it often meant something had gone wrong and blame was coming. Even play, when it happened, was timed. You knew how long you had before your mother's voice called you back. You knew not to lose track. Time was always watching, like a god, like a warden. And Sundays, those rare islands in the river of labor, weren't really yours either. Yes, you didn't work, but you didn't rest either. Sundays were for church, for mending clothes, for preparing meals and cleaning floors and washing yourself for the week ahead. You might attend a Sabbath school, where Bible verses were memorized and moral instruction drilled in. The message was always the same: obedience, punctuality, gratitude. Be thankful you had work. Be thankful you weren't starving, even if you were. Some reformers tried to push back against this tyranny of the clock. They proposed laws limiting child labor to 10 hours a day. Factory owners fought them bitterly, claiming such restrictions would ruin industry. The economy will collapse, they said. Children will roam the streets. To them, discipline was not a moral failing. It was an economic necessity. A slow child was a lost profit. A defiant child was a contagion. And so the clock ruled on. And this rule, this crushing control of time, didn't just shape your days, it shaped your future. You grew up measuring yourself by efficiency, by obedience, by how little rest you could survive on. You didn't ask what you wanted to do. You asked what would keep the overseer happy. You stopped asking questions altogether. After all, curiosity wasn't profitable. So when people today talk about time management or clocking in or factory precision, they're echoing a legacy built on your bones. The modern workday was forged in these fires, these dark mills where children learned, minute by agonizing minute, that their time was not their own, that their bodies were machines, that to hesitate, to falter, to slow, even for a heartbeat, was to invite pain. Because in the Industrial Revolution, the clock didn't tell you the time. It told you who you belonged to. And it was never you. It's easy to assume that all of this, the violence, the exhaustion, the injuries, must have happened in a world with no rules, no protections, no laws. But here's the thing, laws did exist. There were pages upon pages of regulations, committees, commissions, and even public debates about child labor. But they didn't stop your pain. They didn't stop your hours. They didn't stop your injuries. Because the rules, the ones written in polished offices and spoken in clean parliamentary halls, weren't made for you. And even when they claimed they were never enforced where it mattered. The first law in Britain that even attempted to deal with child labor came in 1802, the Health and Morals of Apprentices Act. It sounds noble, right? Health, morals, but its reach was narrow. It applied only to apprentices, children officially bound to a master through legal contract, usually in textile mills. That left out tens of thousands of children who weren't apprentices at all, just desperate kids hired by the day or week. The law said apprentices shouldn't work more than 12 hours a day. But who enforced that? There were no inspectors, no factory police. If your master told you to work 14 hours, you did it, because you were scared of losing even that miserable job. Over the next few decades, more laws were passed. The 1833 Factory Act, the 1842 Mines Act, the 1844 Factory Act, all noble sounding, all flawed. The 1833 Act, for example, said children under 9 couldn't work in textile mills, and those between 9 and 13 could work only 48 hours a week. It even required 2 hours of schooling a day. It sounded like a breakthrough, but in practice, nothing changed. Employers forged ages, parents lied to get their children hired, and the schooling was often just a Sunday school classroom with no teacher, no materials, and no future. By 1842, after numerous scandals and public outcry, Parliament passed a law banning children under 10 from working underground in coal mines. But the law didn't ban boys from surface work or girls from working above ground in dangerous hauling jobs. So the abuse continued, just hidden better. Besides, enforcement was a joke. There were 4 inspectors to cover all of England and Wales, 4 men for hundreds of thousands of children. And when inspectors did show up, the factories already knew they were coming. It became a performance, a lie in motion. Overseers would clean up the floors, hide the injured children, pull the youngest kids off the machines and tell them to stand over there and smile. If inspectors asked questions, children were told to recite a script. I am 13 years old. I work only 8 hours a day. I enjoy my labor. If you said anything different, your parents might lose their job. Or you might be beaten once the inspector left. So you lied. And they smiled, and the law was satisfied. Even when abuse was exposed, consequences were minimal. A factory might be fined a few pounds for hiring underage children. But what was a few pounds when you were making hundreds in profit every week? The penalties didn't deter anyone. If anything, they encouraged more rule breaking because owners knew they could just pay the fine and carry on. The cost of a child's life was less than the cost of stopping the machines. And while laws on paper promised shorter hours, they came with loopholes you could drive a steam engine through. Take the 10 Hours Act of 1847. It was supposed to limit women and children to 10-hour workdays, but guess what? It didn't apply to all industries, just textiles. It didn't apply to metalworks, or glass factories, or brick kilns, or matchstick plants, or paper mills. And even in the industries it did apply to, owners simply staggered shifts or altered job titles to skirt the rules. If you were helping your mother, your labor didn't count. If you were training for a role, your hours weren't recorded. Even the definition of child was flexible. Some employers insisted 7-year-olds were actually 9. Some said that 10-year-olds were fully grown. Birth certificates weren't mandatory. Records were rare. And even when age limits were clear, parents had incentive to cheat, not because they didn't love their children, but because they needed the income. If the difference between your baby starving and eating was forging a number, what would you do? And still, the laws kept coming. Like window dressing on a burning building, they made lawmakers feel better. They gave newspapers headlines. But for the children inside the factories, nothing truly changed. The work went on, the injuries piled up. The deaths didn't stop. The factory owners still held the power. And every time a new law was proposed, they fought it tooth and nail. They argued that children were better off working, that idle hands led to crime, that factory life taught discipline and moral character. They pointed to the rare cases of children who rose through the ranks, a mill boy who became a foreman, a girl who learned to read in night school. These stories were exceptions, but they were waved like banners. Evidence, they said, that child labor wasn't cruel, it was character building. Meanwhile, the children who had lost arms, lungs, eyesight, the ones buried in unnamed graves behind the mills, they didn't make headlines. They didn't speak at parliament hearings. They were invisible, forgotten, collateral. And the truth is, the rules weren't even made with you in mind. They were made for the middle class, for the reformers who could afford to care, for the politicians who wanted votes, for the factory owners who wanted good press. You, the child coughing in the dust, stitching in the dark, bleeding at the loom, you were just a footnote. When reformers finally succeeded in establishing something closer to real protections, like the Education Act of 1870 or the Factory, and Workshop Act of 1878, it wasn't tea because lawmakers suddenly found their conscience. It was because society needed better workers. Industrial Britain realized it couldn't keep feeding children to the machines and expect economic stability. It needed literate, healthy citizens. It needed soldiers. It needed voters. So it invested in children, not out of kindness, but necessity. And by then, for millions of children, it was too late. Because while the rules were being debated, they had already worked their shifts. They had already lost their limbs. They had already died from lung disease or typhoid or burns or broken backs. And no one was punished. No one paid reparations. No one stood trial. History moved on. The rules improved. But the children didn't come back. So when you look at the rules of the Industrial Revolution, the long, complex, lager-written codes that filled government ledgers, you must ask one question. Who are they really for? Because they weren't made for the 11-year-old girl who lost her scalp to the spinning mule. They weren't made for the trapper boy who died in the mine shaft. They weren't made for the chimney sweep who suffocated halfway up the flue. The rules were made for everyone else. There's a reason we say that children grow up too fast. But in the factories, in the workhouses, in the soot-stained streets of industrial towns, children didn't just grow up fast. They skipped childhood entirely. There was no slow transition into maturity. No time for innocence, no room for mischief, because the very idea of childhood, the freedom to explore, to play, to make mistakes, simply didn't exist. If you laughed too loud, you were scolded. If you played during a break, you were beaten. If you cried, you were ignored. You learned quickly, fun was a threat. What did play look like in the early 19th century? For children of the wealthy, it meant dolls, puzzles, toy soldiers, swings in gardens, games with governesses, the first inklings of modern childhood. But for children of the working class, the children we read talking about, play was a forbidden luxury. If it happened at all, it was fleeting. A stone kicked down the street, a skipping rope made of rags, a makeshift game of tag in the alleys before the factory bell rang. And every time you played, you watched your back, because joy was suspicious. Overseers viewed it as laziness. Parents, worn down by poverty, often discouraged it too, not because they were cruel, but because they couldn't afford for their child to act like a child. You were reminded constantly, you're not here to play. You're here to earn. Even at 6 or 7 years old, your worth was measured not in giggles or curiosity, but in pennies brought home. If you were caught playing during work hours, even for a second, you could be whipped. Imagine it. You're a 9-year-old girl in a cotton mill, giggling as you tie a piece of thread into a bow while no one's looking. Suddenly, you're yanked away from the machine and slapped. Maybe with a hand, maybe with a strap, maybe with the flat side of a wooden cane. This is not a playground, the overseer growls, and it isn't. It never was. The fear wasn't just of punishment, it was of being seen as unserious. Being childish was dangerous. It meant you could be dismissed, replaced. There were always more children desperate for work. Children who didn't waste time fooling about. You learned to suppress every instinct that made you young. Curiosity, laughter, spontaneity. You learned to walk in straight lines, talk only when spoken to, and flinch when an adult raised their hand, even if it was just to point. Play wasn't outlawed, not officially, but the entire structure of your life made it impossible. Your day started at 5 or 6 a, ended after 6 or 7 p.m., and was followed by household chores, errands, or caring for younger siblings. By the time you crawled into bed, you were too exhausted to even think, let alone play. Sundays were your only hope, and even then, the time was usually spent in church, in prayer, in silent reflection, not in games, not in laughter. When you did manage to find moments of joy, they were stolen, secret. A game of marbles played with pebbles during lunch. A rhyme whispered while cleaning boots. A chalk drying on a factory wall, scrub it off before the foreman saw. These moments were rare, and they were precious. Because deep down you knew, joy didn't last. It was always interrupted by responsibility, by adult expectations, by a system that saw your play as a defect. Worse, there were places where even pretending to be a child was criminalized. In workhouses, the dreaded institutions for the poor, children were separated from their families and raised in silence. Laughter was discouraged, movement was regimented. The very idea of playtime was associated with disorder. Boys and girls marched in rows, sat at attention, ate in silence. Any attempt to introduce games was seen as coddling. In fact, some workhouses deliberately removed play from schedules because it encouraged idleness. The psychological toll was devastating. Modern childhood is supposed to be a period of social learning, where games teach fairness, boundaries, empathy. But Industrial Revolution children weren't taught to share. They were taught to endure. No one asked if you had friends. They asked if you earned your keep. No one praised creativity. They praised obedience. So when your spirit tried to shine through, when you dared to be silly or joyful or imaginative, it had to be hidden. Sometimes this internal pressure exploded. There are scattered accounts of children who lashed out, not in violence, but in play. One boy in a Yorkshire mill, after weeks of endless spinning work, reportedly began laughing uncontrollably in the middle of his shift. Not because something was funny, but because he couldn't stop. His laughter became hysterical. He was dragged outside and beaten. The overseer called it madness. In truth, it was a breakdown, a mind cracking under the weight of its own repressed joy. The tragic irony is that industrial towns were filled with the materials of play. Stones, sticks, discarded wheels, stray dogs, all things a child might transform into toys in another context. But in the factory world, these things were clutter, distractions, waste. Play was not only unproductive, it was dangerous. Imagine trying to skip a rope near a spinning loom. Imagine trying to chase a ball in a coal yard. One misstep, one trip, and your body could be pulled into the machine. Fun became fatal. Parents didn't always agree with this repression. Some tried to protect their children's innocence, to preserve a little spark of youth. A mother might save a penny each week to buy a second-hand doll. A father might carve a toy horse out of scrap wood. But those moments were rare, and they were often met with scorn from others. "What are you doing?" neighbors would whisper. That child should be grateful to eat, not wasting time with playthings. There were even cultural critics, early psychologists and moralists, who argued that poor children didn't need play, that indulging them with toys or games would spoil them, would make them forget their place. One 19th century writer famously declared that too much cheer in a working child breeds sloth and sin. The Industrial Revolution didn't just rob children of their time. It convinced society that they didn't deserve childhood at all. But the truth is, children played anyway. Not because they were allowed, but because they had to. Because something inside them, something primal and human, needed to imagine, needed to laugh, needed to pretend they weren't workers, that they were pirates or knights or explorers, for even 5 minutes, even inside a coal cart, even behind the soot. These tiny acts of defiance, the secret giggles, the stolen games, they mattered. Because in a world built to crush childhood, play became rebellion. It wasn't a luxury. It was survival. So when you see pictures of children from this era, unsmiling, dirt-smudged, eyes hollow, remember that the saddest part isn't just that they worked. It's that no one let them be children, that even joy was punished, that play was a crime. Before you were old enough to understand your own body, you were already expected to care for another, to feed them, dress them, bathe them, quiet their cries. Not as a sibling in play, but as a surrogate parent, as a caretaker, as a stand-in adult. In the twisted logic of industrial poverty, you were a child responsible for children because there simply was no one else. Your mother worked, sometimes 12 to 14 hours, bent over spinning machines or scrubbing floors in someone else's home. Your father, if he was around, labored long shifts in mines or factories, or not at all. Maybe he was sick, injured, drunk, or dead. That left you, the eldest daughter, or sometimes even a son, to take charge of the household. At age 8, maybe 10, and no one asked if you were ready. You weren't. You just had to manage. This role wasn't acknowledged with pride. It wasn't celebrated or rewarded. It was invisible, something you were simply expected to do. If you were a girl, this burden came down on you especially hard. Society already believed that women were natural caregivers. So even before your hips widened, before you bled for the first time, you were told you were a mother in training. Your practice began with real babies, your siblings. Your mornings might begin by feeding porridge to a toddler while trying to comb your own hair. You dechange a baby's rags, there were no diapers, then sling him over your hip, and walk him to the neighbors while you rushed to the mill. If he cried while you worked, you might be whipped for causing a scene, but you still had to return to him on your break, nurse him if your mother couldn't, or rock him back to sleep so your own shift could continue. In many cases, families had to make a brutal decision. Who stays home with the baby? The answer was almost always the child. You, the 7-year-old who could have been at school. If school existed for you, you didn't learn your alphabet. You learned how to calm an infant, how to boil water without burning yourself, how to sweep the hearth. You weren't a girl anymore. You were little mother, and no one thanked you. Sometimes you brought your sibling to the factory. Babies were wrapped in blankets and laid beside the looms or in the corners of coal yards. You fed them on your lap when your hands weren't spinning cotton, but machines don't stop for crying infants. And if the baby wailed too long, you were reprimanded. Control it, the overseer barked, as if a toddler were a switch to be flicked. You might be docked pay or kicked off the shift altogether. If you were unlucky and the baby got sick while you were alone, with no adults, no doctors, It was your responsibility. You tried remedies you'd overheard from neighbors, applied wet cloths, blew on fevered skin, prayed. If the child died, it was often treated like a failure on your part. Not the system's, not poverty's, yours. Imagine carrying that guilt at age 9. Imagine being blamed for a death before you even understood what death meant. And if you were a boy, things weren't much better. You might not be tasked with changing diapers, but you were expected to be the man of the house before your voice had even cracked. That meant earning, providing, protecting. If your father disappeared or died in a mining collapse, not uncommon, the weight of income fell on your shoulders. You might only be 11, but you were expected to act 30. What's worse, adults didn't see anything wrong with this. Victorian society romanticized these young caregivers. Writers spoke of noble young girls who gave up their youth to raise siblings. Newspapers praised boy laborers who kept the family together after their father's death. These weren't warnings, they were virtues. The suffering wasn't considered tragic. It was celebrated. You weren't being crushed, you were being molded into a future wife, a future father, a future cog in the machine. But here's the truth. It was too much. Children cracked under this pressure, not loudly, not publicly. They weren't allowed to cry or protest, but they withdrew. The weight of responsibility turned childhood into a quiet, suffocating march. Girls lost their laughter. Boys lost their wonder. They carried siblings like burdens, not because they didn't love them, but because the system had turned love into labor. And when you failed, when the baby got sick, or the fire went out, or your brother ran into the street chasing a dog and got hit by a cart, it wasn't until you treated with empathy, it was treated with scorn. You were supposed to be watching him. Your mother might scream, not because she hated you, but because she was broken too. Her anger was exhaustion. Her blame was misplaced grief. But to you, it was another reminder. You don't get to make mistakes. Even institutions reinforce this belief. In workhouses, older children were paired with younger ones, assigned nursery duty or training roles. In orphanages, siblings were separated, but the elder was told to write letters, to send money, to set an example. Playtime, that was for those with nannies. You had dependents. The language of adulthood bled into your life long before you were ready. You referred to your baby sister as my girl. You told neighbors, I have mouths to feed. You counted pennies with the dread of a debt collector. You gave up your seat for others. You went without bread so the toddler wouldn't cry. No one taught you how to read, but you were fluent in sacrifice. So when people today talk about growing up too fast, know that for these children, there was no growth, no arc, no graduation. There was just a sudden, brutal shift. One day, you were playing in the dirt. The next, you were keeping a baby alive, with no support, no preparation, no forgiveness if you failed. Because in the Industrial Revolution, childhood wasn't just stolen by work. It was stolen by responsibility. You were a parent long before puberty, and no one ever let you stop. To be poor in the Industrial Revolution was bad enough. But to be a poor child, that wasn't just unfortunate. It was treated as a kind of sin. Your suffering wasn't seen as a failure of the system. It was seen as your own fault. Society looked at you, a child with blistered feet, a dirty face, a growling stomach, and saw not a victim, but a problem, a burden, a threat. You weren't given pity. You were given punishment. From the moment you were born into a working-class family, everything about your life was marked by scarcity. Food, clothing, warmth, space, all of it came in tiny rationed amounts, if at all. But society didn't treat that as misfortune. They treated it as moral evidence. If your parents were poor, it must mean they were lazy. If your clothes were torn, it must mean you didn't take care of yourself. If you hadn't eaten in days, it must mean your family made bad choices. That was the logic, cold, circular, and inescapable. This punishment wasn't always physical, though that came too. Often, it was structural. If you were poor, you were excluded. You couldn't go to the same schools as wealthier children, assuming school was even an option at all. When education did exist for working-class kids, it was usually in overcrowded charity schools or Sunday schools. These were less about learning and more about obedience. Instead of literature or arithmetic, you were drilled in religious morality, honor thy master, work hard, be grateful. You weren't taught how to escape poverty. You were taught how to accept it. Even religion, which many hoped would offer comfort, became a tool of discipline. Preachers thundered from pulpits about the virtues of hard work, the dangers of idleness, and the divine order of society. Being poor was your test, they said. Your burden, your punishment from God, and if you dared to complain, it was proof you deserved it. And so even your prayers were whispered in guilt. Institutions treated you no better. If your family fell behind on rent or lost work due to injury, you were sent to the workhouse, a name that still sends shivers down any spine that knows the truth. These places were designed not to help the poor, but to shame them. Conditions were deliberately cruel to discourage dependency. Families were separated. Children were stripped, scrubbed, uniformed, and marched into strict labor routines. You might spend the day picking oakum, unraveling thick ropes, until your fingers bled, or scrubbing coal off bricks for pennies. You were told this would teach you discipline, but it didn't. It taught you that poverty was a crime, and you were already guilty. And when you weren't in a workhouse, when you were lucky enough to be with your family, the punishment continued, just more subtly. Landlords overcharged you for damp, cramped tenements with no ventilation and no toilets. Shopkeepers raised prices for poor neighborhoods because they knew you had no choice but to pay. Doctors refused treatment unless money was paid up front. You didn't matter. Not to them, not to the city, not to the law. Even the streets reminded you of your place. If you loitered outside a bakery, not stealing, just staring through the window, a constable might shove you along with a baton. If you played in a public park without shoes, you'd be yelled at. If you begged, you could be arrested. There were actual laws, like the Vagrancy Acts, that allowed police to imprison children who had no visible source of income. Imagine that. Being imprisoned because you were too young to earn and too poor to survive. And heaven help you if you committed an actual crime. Petty theft, stealing a loaf of bread, a candle, a piece of cloth was common because you were hungry, cold, desperate, but the courts didn't care. Many children as young as 8 were arrested and hauled before magistrates. Some were sentenced to imprisonment, others to flogging, and many to transportation, forced relocation to penal colonies like Australia, never to return. All for crimes committed by children trying to stay alive. One famous example, Mary Wade, just 11 years old, was sentenced to death for stealing clothes. Her sentence was later commuted to transportation. She spent the rest of her life in Australia. Think about that. A child condemned to exile for being poor and cold. Hers was not an exception, it was a symbol. And then came the media. The newspapers of the time loved to print stories about juvenile delinquents, painting poor children as unruly, violent, immoral. Not victims of poverty, but products of it. Editorials called for stronger discipline, harsher punishments, stricter schooling, and always, always, for children of the working class, the rich had tutors and governesses, the poor had whips and prisons. This moral double standard stretched across every part of life. If a rich child got into mischief, it was called a phase. If a poor child did the same, it was called a path to ruin. If a wealthy family lost their money, it was a tragedy. If your family was poor from the beginning, it was your fault. Even accidents weren't treated the same. If you were injured in a factory, You might be blamed for clumsiness, but if the overseer's son stubbed his toe, it was a grievous mishap. And perhaps the cruelest part, society trained you to accept this blame. You heard it so often from so many places that you started to believe it. You believed that you were stupid, lazy, dirty. You looked at your torn shoes and thought, I don't deserve better. You looked at your father coughing blood and thought, we failed somehow. You were a child and you were punished, not just with labor, but with shame. Some tried to fight back, reformers, writers, activists. Charles Dickens wrote Oliver Twist and Hard Times to expose the cruelty. Social reformers like Lord Shaftesbury campaigned for better housing and child labor laws. But change was slow, and for millions of children across the industrial world, it came too late. Because while factories stole your health, while time stole your play, while machines stole your limbs, poverty stole your dignity. You were punished for being born into a world you didn't choose. And worst of all, you were taught to think it was your own fault. At some point, you probably hoped things would get better. Maybe when you were hungry. Maybe when your back ached after a shift. Maybe when you saw an adult walk past, clean, tall, powerful, you hoped they would stop, that they would notice you, that they would ask what was wrong and take you somewhere safe. But they never did, because in the world of the Industrial Revolution, no one was coming to save you. Not the government, not the church, not your boss, not the law. You were alone, a child standing in a whirlwind of gears, smoke, and indifference. And that loneliness wasn't metaphorical. It was bone deep, every single day. You could scream in pain and be told to stop making a fuss. You could faint from hunger and be dragged back to your post. You could go missing for hours and no one would even ask your name. You were background noise in a system that only valued your hands, not your voice. Your family couldn't save you either, not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't. Your mother was likely working longer hours than you. Your father, if alive and employed, was exhausted, injured, or too broken to fight for more. If your siblings were older, they were already trapped in the same machines. If younger, they became your burden, another mouth to feed, another pair of feet to carry when they cried. And if someone did try to help, it rarely changed anything. Some factory owners, a rare few, were kinder than others. They'd allow slightly shorter shifts or build small schoolrooms. Some offered housing or porridge on cold days. But these were exceptions. Acts of individual mercy in a system designed for maximum profit, minimum cost. Even when employers meant well, they still expected obedience, efficiency, gratitude. Oh, we're still a cog. Just a slightly more polished one. You might have heard of reformers, people who went to Parliament and argued about child labor. Lord Ashley, Robert Owen, the Quakers. Some even visited factories and workhouses to report the horrors. But they were slow, so slow. Years passed between speeches and votes. A decade might pass before a bill became law. And even then, no one enforced it. You could die under the machine long before the ink dried on a single page. You were always told, help is coming. Be patient, it will get better. But when? When your childhood was already gone? When your hands had already lost their fingers? When your lungs were already black from coal dust? And what about the church? Surely they would help? Sometimes. A kind vicar might let you sit in the back pew. A Sunday school might teach you a Bible verse. But the sermons rarely comforted you. They told you to accept your suffering, that poverty was your cross to bear, that heaven would reward your obedience. You didn't want heaven. You wanted bread. You wanted a bed that didn't freeze your bones at night. You wanted someone to look you in the eye and say, you shouldn't have to live like this. Even the charities, the well-meaning do-gooders who handed out soup and donated shoes were limited. They helped a few, the lucky, the most desperate, but they didn't have the power to change the system. And if you didn't smile and say thank you, if you weren't pious and neat and humble, they moved on. The help was conditional. It came with judgment. It came with rules. You weren't just poor, you had to be the right kind of poor. You might think the law would protect you. That if someone abused you or overworked you or locked you in a cellar for 18 hours, the police would help. They wouldn't. The law existed to protect property, not people. And children, in the eyes of the state, were closer to property than citizens. You belonged to your parents or your employer. If they mistreated you, it was considered a domestic matter. Something private, something not worth interfering in. Only the most public, brutal abuses ever made it to court. And even then, punishments were small fines, slaps on the wrist. And if you broke the law, even out of desperation, for a crust of bread or a pair of shoes, you were punished with the full weight of the system. You weren't a victim. You were a threat you could try to run. Some children did. They escaped factories. They climbed out of workhouse windows. They fled to cities and tried to vanish into the crowd. But life on the streets was no escape. It was just a different kind of hell. Hunger, disease, assault, arrest. You were still alone, still unsafe, still invisible. Eventually, most stopped trying. You learned to live without help. Without hope, you hardened. Your face stopped smiling. Your back stopped standing straight. You became what they wanted, quiet, obedient, broken. And if you were lucky enough to survive into adulthood, you carried that emptiness with you. Not just in your body, but in your soul. You forgot how to play. You forgot how to dream. You raised your own children with fear, with rigid rules. Not because you were cruel, but because you knew the world would not be kind to them either. You thought, no one saved me. I can't save them. But maybe if they're obedient, they'll survive. That's the legacy of being a child in the Industrial Revolution. Not just the injuries, not just the hunger, but the betrayal of every adult who turned away, every system that shrugged, every preacher who told you to wait for heaven, every lawmaker who said, not yet. Because when you needed the world most, it wasn't just silent, it was absent. You weren't rescued. You weren't defended. You weren't even seen. And you learned the hardest truth of all. If no one saves you, you have to stop needing saving. That's not childhood. That's survival. It wasn't just that you worked with the machines. It was that the machines reshaped you, bent you, warped you, took your soft growing bones and molded them into tools that fit their design. You weren't a person to the factory owner. You were an extension of the gears. And like gears, you had to be precise, small, replaceable. They said children were perfect for the Industrial Revolution. You were small enough to crawl under machines, light enough to balance on high beams, nimble enough to tie threads the adults couldn't. Your tiny fingers could reach where others couldn't. Your thin frame could squeeze through tight, dangerous passages. It was your body, your size, your softness, your incompleteness that made you valuable. And so the machines got to you first, before life even had a chance. If you were sent to a textile mill, you might spend your days tending the spinning frames or piecing broken threads. The machines ran faster than the eye could follow, so you had to move in rhythm, quick, mechanical, precise. You stood for 12, sometimes 14 hours a day, never sitting. Always alert, always repeating the same movement. Your feet blistered and bled, your spine curved from hunching forward. You didn't just work next to machines, you became one. Children who worked the power looms developed permanent deformities. Your arms grew lopsided from repetitive motion. Your knees bent inward from standing still too long. Some children were referred to in reports as bent doubles, permanently hunched by age 10. Factory inspectors noted how girls aged 8 to 12 showed signs of early arthritis. Boys had spines like question marks. Your muscles didn't grow strong, they grew rigid, because they were never allowed to rest. And if your job was in the coal mines, the effects were even worse. You might be a trapper, a child who sat in the dark, opening and closing ventilation doors for hours at a time. Total darkness, no lamp, no sound except the occasional rumble of cartwheels. Children went mad in that silence. They grew pale, stunted, anxious. Some forgot how to speak. Others developed twisted limbs from squatting in one position for 12 hours straight. If you were a hurrier or a putter, dragging carts of coal on hands and knees, your body was mutilated by movement. You wore a belt with a chain between your legs, crawling like a beast of burden day after day. Girls lost their hair to friction. Boys developed raw, permanent bruises on their shoulders and hips. You'd hear stories of children with broken ribs that never healed properly, of knees that swelled and calcified. You grew crooked, and no one cared. Out in the brickyards or glassworks, your skin was the first thing to go. Kilns scorched your hands. Hot clay stuck to your arms and burned through your rags. You worked barefoot on hot ground. Your feet blistered, cracked, sometimes bled onto the bricks you were carrying. By the time you were 10, your solace looked like they belonged to someone 50, hardened, calloused, burned. And then there were the chemical factories. The matchstick girls. The children who dipped phosphorus for hours a day, coating match heads until their fingers glowed, until their jaws rotted. Phossy jaw, they called it, a horrible necrosis of the bone caused by phosphorus exposure. Your breath stank of decay. Your face swelled on one side. Eventually your teeth fell out, then parts of your jawbone. And still, you came to work, because what choice did you have? The damage wasn't always visible right away. Sometimes it started small, a sore back, a twisted ankle, a chronic cough. But those small things never healed. They festered, they grew. No child saw a doctor. No employer offered treatment. You learned to walk with a limp, to work with a dislocated shoulder, to breathe with lungs filled with soot. Your injuries were normalized, even romanticized. Some employers saw it as proof of commitment. One mill owner famously referred to his child laborers as little ironlings. Durable, tough, productive. He spoke of them like machines. Not once did he mention that most wouldn't survive past 30, that their bodies were wrecked before they reached adulthood, that some were so physically deformed by their teenage years that they could no longer do adult labor. Girls suffered in their own ways, often in silence. Factory work stunted their growth, delayed or disrupted menstruation, and left their bodies misshapen. Many entered womanhood with spines bent, hips unbalanced, and backs too weak to carry children, and yet society expected them to become mothers, to care for families, to feed more mouths on broken legs and arthritic fingers. But the deepest wound wasn't always the physical deformity. It was the sense that your body didn't belong to you. It belonged to the machine, to the factory, to the profit. You were a tool, and tools don't complain. If your hands bled, you wrapped them and kept working. If your knees gave out, you crawled. If your eye was burned by flying glass, you worked with the other one. And when your body finally gave out, when your back broke, or your arms stiffened, or you lost a foot to the gears, you weren't repaired. You were replaced. Another child was always waiting, one smaller, one quieter, one who hadn't yet been reshaped. Working in a factory as a child during the Industrial Revolution meant waking up every day not knowing whether you would come home with the same number of body parts. It wasn't hyperbole. It was the background noise of your life, the quiet, gnawing fear that the machine, with its cold, metallic hunger, might decide that today was your day. And when it happened fast. One moment, you were threading yarn or reaching under a loom to clear dust. The next, you were bleeding, screaming, or unconscious, if you were lucky enough to scream at all. The machines were monstrous in both size and purpose, designed to run continuously and mercilessly, churning out product after product with no thought for the human hands nearby. These machines had no safety guards, no automatic shutoffs, no emergency brakes. They were made for speed and profit, not protection. And since children were considered ideal for their small bodies and quick fingers, it was you who worked closest to them. It was you who got pulled in. Children were frequently expected to clean and service machinery while it was still running. It saved time, and in the eyes of factory owners, time was money. Supervisors barked orders while looms whirred and belts snapped overhead. You were told to crawl underneath spinning wheels or duck between moving shafts to grab a piece of thread, remove lint, or adjust a part. In such spaces, there was no room for error, no second chances. The moment your finger slipped or your foot failed to step back fast enough, the machine didn't pause to ask questions. It clamped down, spun on, and pulled you in like just another bolt of cloth. Some children lost fingers, some lost hands. Others lost arms, feet, legs, sometimes their lives. Reports from the time describe horrifying incidents. Young boys with their scalps ripped off after their hair caught in rollers. Girls whose aprons were pulled into gears, dragging their torsos along with it. Surgeons, when called, performed brutal amputations without anesthesia. You were strapped down and sawed open, conscious, aware, and terrified, because ether was expensive and only used in hospitals the poor didn't have access to. Infection often followed, and so did death. There was no compensation, no apology, no recognition of the injury beyond how it affected productivity. If you lost an arm and couldn't work, you were let go. You might be given a coin or two out of pity, or none at all. You became a burden instead of a worker. The logic of the factory was cruelly simple. Children were cheaper to replace than to protect. Not all the pain came from the machines themselves. In the coal mines, you might be a hurrier, crawling on hands and knees to pull heavy carts of coal through narrow, jagged tunnels. Collapses were common, so were crushed limbs. If a cart rolled backward on an incline, it didn't matter who or what was in the way. Children were flattened, broken, buried. Others, serving as trappers who opened and shut ventilation doors, might be trapped themselves in collapses or forgotten in the pitch black for hours, their minds unraveling in the silence. No job was safe. In ironworks and glass factories, searing heat and open flames turned small missteps into massive burns. You could trip and fall into molten metal, spill boiling liquid on your arms, or drop a sheet of glass and slice yourself to the bone. In match factories, you breathed toxic fumes that poisoned your jaw until your bones decayed. You lived with open wounds, you walked with festering sores. If a girl lost a hand, she might lose her only shot at marriage, a fate society treated as a worse tragedy than the injury itself. Even if you survived the physical damage, the trauma followed you. Children who witnessed co-workers being crushed or burned often had nightmares for years. But there was no space to grieve or rest. The very next shift, the whistle blew, and the line had to keep moving. You returned to the machine that had mangled your friend, with no time to reflect and no power to resist. No one asked if you were scared. No one offered time off. You worked, or you were gone. The few laws that did exist to protect child laborers were either weak or openly ignored. Inspectors rarely visited. Factory owners bribed officials. And even when a tragic injury made the newspaper, it was quickly forgotten, buried under profits, soot, and silence. Children were treated as expendable fuel in the fires of industrial growth. Your blood, your bones, your body parts, they were all part of the cost of doing business. And so you learned to live with the fear. You learned to move carefully, to breathe shallowly, to avoid attracting attention. You memorized the rhythm of the machines the way a soldier memorizes the weight of a rifle. You knew which ones kicked, which ones hissed, which ones could kill you. Still, none of that could save you because you were tired. You were hungry, and at 8 years old, you simply weren't fast enough to beat a machine built for speed. In the end, it was never a question of if something would happen, only when, because the truth was brutal and unchanging. You could lose a limb any day, and when you did, the machine wouldn't notice. It wouldn't stop. It would just keep turning. You felt pain early, not the vague discomfort of scraped knees or bruised elbows, but a deeper, sharper ache that wrapped itself around your bones and refused to let go. At first, you tried to cry. That's what children do. But you learned quickly that in the world you were born into, pain wasn't something you expressed. It was something you swallowed. It wasn't yours to own. It belonged to someone else, to your overseer, your employer, your parents, your priest. Everyone but you had the right to decide whether your pain mattered. It began the moment you showed weakness. If your hands trembled too much to tie thread, or your foot swelled from standing too long, or your head spun from the heat, and you dared to say something, the response was swift. Stop whining. You're just lazy. Other children do twice the work and say nothing. Your pain wasn't treated as a warning or a signal. It was an offense. Something that made you less useful, less obedient. A flaw. And like all flaws in the factory system, it needed to be punished, not soothed. This culture of silence wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, trained into you from the moment you could speak. Complaints were met with docked wages or beatings. Tears earned you mockery or dismissal. If you fainted, they poured cold water on your face and sent you back to the machine. If your hands bled from broken glass or your ears rang from the constant roar of looms, you were told to toughen up. And if you kept protesting, if your body finally gave out, then you were replaced. Adults around you were no better off, and so they could offer no comfort. Your parents were often just as numb, just as hardened, just as afraid of being noticed. They had been taught to suppress their own pain, and now expected you to do the same. Not out of cruelty, but out of survival. Keep your head down, don't complain. Just get through the day. They weren't just warnings. They were the rules of life in a world where compassion costs too much. Even your peers, other children, couldn't help. You might sit beside someone your age, coughing up soot or limping from a burn, and they'd say nothing. Not because they didn't care, but because they didn't dare. Empathy had to be hidden, buried beneath a mask of endurance. Because if you were too kind, if you reached out to help someone in pain, you drew attention to yourself. You risked punishment too. And when your pain became unbearable, when you cried silently at night, curled up on a straw mattress with your fingers raw, your lungs aching, your body locked in cramps, there was nowhere to take it. No doctor, no medication. No soft voice telling you, it's going to be okay. The churches might tell you to pray. The newspapers might scold your parents for letting you fall ill. But no one came to treat the wound. No one wanted to know what it felt like, because in truth, your pain wasn't invisible. It was simply inconvenient. For the factory owners, your suffering interfered with production. For the reformers, it was evidence to be cataloged, measured in charts and tables, not in cries and nightmares. For the public, it was a distant scandal, something sad and terrible, but far enough away to ignore. And for the machinery itself, your pain meant nothing. The gears kept spinning. The smoke kept rising. The shifts kept starting on time. Your broken body was simply another expense, another wasted resource. Even when your pain was obvious, when your hand was swollen, when your limp was visible, when your face twisted in agony, people refused to acknowledge it. Because acknowledging it would mean admitting guilt, that someone had let this happen, that someone should have stopped it. So instead, they convinced themselves you were exaggerating, that you'd toughen up, that you were stronger than you looked, that children were resilient and pain made them stronger. But it didn't. It made you smaller, quieter, lonelier. Eventually, you stopped talking about it. You stopped naming your injuries. You stopped keeping track of how many days your tooth had throbbed or how many weeks your knee had been swollen. You forgot what it felt like not to hurt. Pain became your atmosphere, the air you breathed, the water you swam in, constant, unquestioned, and that's when they won. Not just because you were hurting, but because you no longer believed you deserved anything else. Sometimes the only time your pain was noticed was when it served someone else's purpose. A philanthropist might point to you in a speech, describing your burned arm as a reason for moral outrage. A journalist might describe your pale face in an expose. A reformer might use your injury as evidence for stricter laws. But even then, it wasn't about you. It was about the cause. Your pain became a symbol, a talking point, a weapon. Not once did anyone ask, how does it feel? And so your pain became a ghost, always present, never acknowledged. You carried it with you, tucked into your spine, wrapped around your joints, buried in the soft tissue of your growing body. It stiffened your walk. It dulled your eyes. It changed the way you slept, sat, stood, breathed. It became part of you. But it was never yours to express. Because in the Industrial Revolution, pain wasn't a signal to help. It was a sign to work harder. By the time you realized your body belonged to someone else, it was already too late. You weren't just a worker or even a victim. You were an investment, a tool, a line in someone's ledger. Your flesh, your breath, your movements, they were all calculated for cost, productivity, and return. In the logic of the Industrial Revolution, you were not a child who labored. You were labor itself, shaped into a human form. From the moment you stepped into the mill or mine or brickyard, your body was measured, not in terms of growth or health, but in terms of utility. Were your arms long enough to reach the spools? Were your fingers small enough to clean the gears? Were your legs strong enough to haul coal? Your value was not in who you were, but what you could do. And when that changed, when you grew too big, too slow, too injured, your worth plummeted like the scrap heaps outside the factory gates. Employers didn't pretend otherwise. They spoke about children the same way they spoke about raw materials, in batches and numbers. Inspectors and owners used words like output, cost efficiency, wear rate. If a machine broke, it was repaired. If a child broke, they were replaced. Reports even calculated the return per child per hour, breaking your life into units of production. You weren't poor. You weren't suffering. You were inefficient, and inefficiency was intolerable. Many factory owners housed their child workers in dormitories or rented slums near the worksite. This wasn't generosity, it was control. You lived under their roof, ate their food, walked to their mill. Your wages were sometimes paid in tokens redeemable only at their stores, where goods were overpriced. If you damaged their property, including your own body, the cost might be deducted from your pay. You were caught in a loop of dependency. They didn't just own your labor. They owned your time, your space, and your future. Some children were even paid wages directly. Orphans and abandoned children were often handed over to factories by the parish system as part of apprenticeship schemes. These schemes were supposed to teach a trade. Instead, they functioned as long-term leases of human bodies. You worked for food and lodging, not money. The work was endless and the treatment brutal. You were legally bound to your employer for years with no right to refuse. You couldn't walk away because legally you weren't free. To many mill owners, this wasn't exploitation, it was a bargain. A child's body cost less to maintain than an adult's. You consumed fewer calories. You accepted lower wages. You complained less. And you didn't yet understand your rights, or even that rights existed. That made you the perfect product. Not quite human, not quite machine, just available. Even your health, or the lack of it, had an economic value. A sick child might work more slowly, but if they died young, they cost less in the long run. Some employers preferred it that way. They didn't want to deal with aging workers who demanded higher pay or more food. They wanted a constant flow of children, pliable, disposable, cheap. You were part of an industrial life cycle born to be consumed. The state, too, treated your body as property. The law rarely protected you, but it always governed you. It decided how many hours you could work, not based on your well-being, but based on social pressure or economic calculation. Laws that limited child labor were fought tooth and nail, not because people doubted the suffering, but because they valued the suffering. Your exhaustion was good for business. Your silence was convenient. Your injuries were affordable. This dehumanization seeped into every aspect of your life. If you were injured on the job, the overseer didn't ask if you were okay. He asked if you could still work. If not, you were dismissed. If you cried too much, you were disciplined. If you fell behind, you were beaten. Not because anyone hated you personally, but because the system couldn't tolerate waste. You were an asset. Assets didn't bleed. Assets performed. And if you died, the factory moved on. Your absence wasn't mourned, it was recorded. A line in a report. A slot to be filled. Maybe your sibling would be sent in your place. Maybe your name would be remembered by the foreman for a week. But no one paused production. No one shut down the line. No one gave your body back to you. Because it had never really been yours to begin with. To be a child in the Industrial Revolution was not just to work. It was to be owned. To have every part of your body calculated, exploited, and monetized. To live in a world where your heartbeat was a byproduct, not a right. Where your breath was borrowed. Where your limbs had a market price. You were not allowed to dream. You were not allowed to rest. You were not allowed to exist beyond your utility. Because your body wasn't yours. The factory bell might have signaled the end of your shift, but it didn't mean relief. Not for a child in the Industrial Revolution. You didn't step into safety or warmth or love. You stepped into another kind of darkness, one that wrapped itself around your neck just as tightly as the factory's schedule had. The streets between the mill and your home were narrow, cold, and choked with soot. Rats darted between your feet. Smoke clung to your lungs. And when you opened the door to the place you were supposed to call home, what waited inside wasn't comfort. It was more work, more hunger, more noise, more pain. Home wasn't a refuge. It was just another place where the world forgot you were a child. Most homes were tenements, overcrowded, crumbling apartment buildings stacked high with the poor. You'd climb dark staircases slick with filth, past doors with broken hinges and windows stuffed with rags. If you were lucky, your family had a single room. That was it. One room for everyone, for sleeping, cooking, eating, washing, arguing, and sometimes dying. The air was stale and thick. There was no ventilation. The walls sweated damp and mold. If someone in the building had typhus or tuberculosis, it wouldn't be long before you had it too. The buildings were so close together that no sunlight reached the lower levels, and the only water source was often a pump shared by hundreds, located out in the street. Your own bed, if you had one, was a wooden plank, a mat on the floor, or maybe a pile of old fabric shared with siblings. You slept head to toe, jammed together for warmth, breathing in each other's coughs. Lice, fleas, and bedbugs were constant companions. You woke up scratching, you went to sleep scratching, and there was no soap, no clean clothes, no privacy. The same rags you worked in all day were the rags you collapsed in at night. They were stiff with dust, grease, sweat, and blood, and you didn't own another set. Even at home, your labor didn't end, especially if you were a girl. After a 12 or 14-hour shift at the mill, you were expected to help your mother prepare food. Sweep the floor, fetch water, care for younger siblings, or mend clothes by candlelight. And if your mother wasn't there, if she was working another shift or sick or gone, then the entire weight of the household might fall on your shoulders. You were 8 or 9 years old, and you were already a surrogate parent, nurse, cook, and cleaner, and no one thanked you for it. This was just what life required. For many boys, home meant discipline. Your father, if he was present, might be drunk, angry, or broken from his own shift. Alcohol was one of the only escapes available to the working poor, but it also meant rage, violence. You might be beaten for crying, or for being too loud, or for nothing at all. You didn't ask questions, you didn't talk back. You moved quietly and hoped not to be noticed. And if your father wasn't around because he had died in the mine or been jailed or disappeared, the poverty was worse. No man's wage meant more hours for you, more mouths to feed, more days without bread. And then there were the illnesses, the never-ending parade of infections that chewed through poor families like fire through dry wood. One child always seemed to be coughing up blood. Another had a wound that wouldn't heal. Babies died of diarrhea and fever. Mothers wasted away slowly from constant childbirth, never recovering between pregnancies. You learned to step over sick bodies, to fetch water without gagging at the smell of the latrine outside, to hold your breath as you pressed a damp rag to your sibling's forehead, knowing you might be next. Sometimes you weren't even with your family. Thousands of children, especially orphans, foundlings, or the unwanted, were sent to live with strangers or in parish-run housing. You might be boarded out to a guardian who was paid a pittance by the government to feed and house you, and who saw you as another source of labor. Others were crammed into workhouses where the routine was strict and cold and lifeless. You worked, you ate gruel, you slept in rows, you were punished for speaking. You were watched constantly, and you were reminded every moment that you were a burden, a mistake being barely tolerated. Even your dreams couldn't save you. When you closed your eyes, you didn't see sunlit fields or safe beds. You saw whirring gears, falling coal carts, and foremen screaming your name. Your nightmares were full of real places, real machines that had nearly taken your hand, real corridors where your friend had died. And sometimes, when you jolted awake in the darkness, the factory was still there in your head. The noise didn't stop. The fear didn't stop. You lived inside it, even while lying motionless on a cold floor. The worst part was, you didn't know any different. If you were born poor during the Industrial Revolution, this was life. There were no stories of anything else. No one said, you deserve better. No one asked, are you happy? You weren't raised with hope. You were raised with endurance, with silence, with the understanding that the world didn't care what happened behind the door of a slum or a cellar or a dormitory. That if you suffered, it was because you were meant to. That if home was hell, it was because you hadn't earned heaven. In middle and upper class homes, a child's tears were met with concern, with comfort. But in your home, if you had one, tears were a luxury. No one had time to soothe. No one had energy to console. Your mother's eyes were ringed with fatigue. Your father's hands were cracked and bleeding. If a sibling died, the mourning was brief, quiet, internal. There was no money for funerals, no time for grief. The next day, you still had to show up at work, still had to sweep the floor, still had to feed whoever was left. For many children, the only moment of peace came not at the end of the day, but in the tiny spaces between disasters. A spoonful of food that wasn't spoiled, a minute to sit before being called to fetch water, a sibling's hand in yours in the dark. You learned to treasure those scraps of quiet, but they weren't enough. They didn't make home a refuge. They just reminded you of what was missing, because no matter how hard the day had been, when you stepped through the door of your house, you didn't escape the cruelty. You just changed its shape. If a child working in the Industrial Revolution had dared to dream of escape, they would have quickly learned there was nowhere to go. The factory floor may have been brutal, the home unforgiving, but the world outside, the alleys, the streets, the villages beyond, didn't offer sanctuary. It offered more of the same or worse. Poverty wasn't a phase you could outgrow. It was a wall, a cage, and every time you thought you found a crack in it, you discovered another lock. For most working class children, the idea of leaving wasn't even considered an option. You didn't fantasize about running away to start a new life, because where would you go? You had no savings, no food, no proper shoes. You couldn't read maps or letters because you likely couldn't read at all. There were no orphanages waiting with open arms, no kind strangers offering shelter. The world wasn't soft. It was hard and cold, and the moment you stepped outside the little corner you called survival, it was quick to remind you just how unwanted you were. Some children tried anyway. They fled the mill gates during lunch or disappeared down side streets at dusk, hoping to find something, anything, other than the endless noise of gears and the sting of overseers' canes. But even the attempt to run came with risk. If you were caught, and you usually were, you faced severe punishment. Factory owners considered you property in every sense but legal, and even the law often sided with them. Children were dragged back by constables, sometimes beaten in front of the other workers as a warning. And if you tried to escape more than once, you could be blacklisted, meaning no other factory would hire you, which for the poor was equivalent to a death sentence. The streets weren't kinder. In industrial towns like Manchester, Leeds, or Birmingham, runaway children didn't vanish into fantasy. They vanished into hunger, into criminal records, into the arms of workhouse officials. You could live on the street, but it meant scavenging rotting food, stealing rags to sell for pennies, and avoiding gangs of adults who knew how to make use of a child desperate enough to obey. Girls were particularly vulnerable, as predators and brothels often hunted the poorest and youngest. Boys were pulled into pickpocket rings or exploited for brutal street labor. There was no freedom on the other side of the fence, only a deeper level of exploitation. If you were caught stealing food, the punishment was swift and public. In some cities, child thieves as young as 8 were sentenced to months of hard labor or time in reform schools, a polite word for miniature prisons. The lucky ones swept floors or sewed uniforms. The unlucky ones broke rocks or sat in solitary confinement for hours, sometimes days. Reform was less about understanding and more about obedience. You were taught not how to survive, but how to submit. The countryside wasn't a sanctuary either. In earlier centuries, a poor child might have fled to a village or farm and begged for work. But by the mid-19th century, rural poverty had deepened. The same forces that built the factories had also enclosed the farmlands. There was no land left to share. The old village safety nets, where a child might be taken in by a neighbor or extended family, had withered under economic strain. Most rural families could barely feed themselves. An extra mouth wasn't kindness, it was starvation. Even the churches, which might have once offered protection, became gatekeepers of suffering. Charity was conditional. If you begged for food or shelter, you might be fed, but only after a sermon, a warning, a punishment, and a promise to return to labor. The Christian ideal of mercy in practice often became an excuse for moralizing. Your suffering was seen as the result of laziness or sin. You weren't helped, you were reformed or rejected. The workhouse loomed large as the last resort, and everyone feared it. Children who ran from the mills might end up in one, but that wasn't escape. That was surrender. The conditions in the workhouse were meant to be worse than in the streets, deliberately so. Families were separated. Children were stripped of their names, their belongings, their freedom. Uniforms replaced clothes. Gruel replaced meals. Silence replaced joy. You worked long hours, often for nothing, in exchange for the bare minimum needed to stay alive. If you tried to run from the workhouse, there were penalties there too: corporal punishment, extended confinement, or being branded a habitual vagrant, a label that followed you forever. And then there were the internal traps, the ones that didn't live on the outside but inside your head. You were told from your earliest days that this was your place, that you were born into poverty because of fate or God or your parents' failings, that hard work might earn you bread, but never freedom. If you were clever, you might become a foreman someday, but you would never own the mill, never escape the soot-stained alley or the freezing tenement. These weren't limitations you chose. They were identities assigned to you. They wrapped around your mind like iron bands, so tightly that even the idea of escape began to feel shameful. And so, most children didn't run, not because they didn't want to, but because there was nowhere left to run to. The system had sealed every exit, locked every gate, and convinced you that freedom was a fairy tale written for someone else. You learned to suppress the urge, to silence the hope. You lowered your head and stepped back into the factory, not because you gave up, but because there was no alternative. You weren't free to go. You weren't free to stay. You existed in a loop, trapped by poverty, fear, law, and expectation. Because in the world of the Industrial Revolution, even if you tried to escape, there was nowhere left to run. If you were a child in the Industrial Revolution, you weren't just crushed by poverty or overwork. You were actively oppressed by every institution meant to protect you. The very forces that were supposed to offer guidance, structure, or justice, the government, the schools, the church, the law, instead turned against you. Not passively, not by accident, but through active, deliberate policies and practices that ensured your suffering continued. There was no protector, no refuge, no hand on your shoulder. Every time you looked up for help, you met the cold, indifferent eyes of power, or worse, a punishing blow. Start with the government. At the height of industrialization, British lawmakers knew what was happening in the mills and mines. They had the reports, the testimonies, the statistics. Children were losing limbs, going blind, dying of exhaustion. Reformers like Lord Ashley and journalists like Edwin Chadwick shouted it from the rooftops. But progress came slowly, painfully slowly, because the men in Parliament were almost entirely wealthy, landowning industrialists or their allies. They profited from your labor. To protect you was to reduce their earnings, so they stalled. They debated. They passed shallow reforms with loopholes wide enough to drive a wagon through. The first real restrictions on child labor weren't enforced. The inspectors were few, often corrupt, and the penalties were minor. The factories carried on. You carried the burden. And when the law did step in, it wasn't for your benefit. It was to discipline you. If you missed work, stole food, or got caught on the street, the police didn't ask why. They didn't see you as a child. They saw you as a criminal. You were thrown in jail or sent to reform school, and the line between those two was razor thin. Judges handed out harsh sentences for petty theft, often committed just to survive. And the reform schools, they didn't teach compassion. They taught obedience, silence, labor. If you cried, you were caned. If you disobeyed, you were isolated. If you broke, no one cared. The education system was another trap. In theory, schooling was expanding. In reality, it was out of reach. For most working-class children, school was a luxury they couldn't afford. And even when factory acts required limited education, it was often just a token hour or two squeezed between shifts. You didn't learn literature or science or art. You learned to count enough to work a till, to read a sign, to write your name on a factory record. Education wasn't empowerment, it was conditioning. It prepared you to be obedient, punctual, and replaceable. Thinking too much, questioning your place, that was dangerous. Schools taught submission before curiosity. memorization before imagination. And then there was the church, the one place that should have offered mercy and kindness. But even here, you were judged more than embraced. Religion during the Industrial Revolution often preached that your poverty was punishment, a reflection of sin, either yours or your family's. If you were suffering, it was your burden to carry with grace. You were told to pray for patience, not deliverance. The sermons praised hard work and humility, even as you bled through your boots. And the charity you were offered came with strings. You had to listen, confess, behave. You had to be deserving of help, and most of the time you weren't. The church didn't stop the beatings. It didn't protect you from the mind collapses or the machines. Sometimes it justified them. Clergy members were often friends with factory owners. Some sat on school boards or poor law committees. They didn't stand in the way of your suffering. They managed it, soft it with scripture, decorated it with moral purpose. But they didn't stop it. The worst betrayal came from the adults who had institutional power over your life. Foremen, overseers, inspectors, and officials. These were the people who made daily choices that shaped your survival. And most of them saw you not as a child, but as a liability, a tool, or a nuisance. If you slowed down, you were punished. If you got sick, you were replaced. If you got injured, it was your fault. Overseers in textile mills carried canes and leather straps. They hit first and asked questions never. Boys were often whipped across the back for dropping bobbins. Girls were pulled by the hair. There were no labor protections, no complaint system, no redress. You simply endured. Even doctors and health officials, where they existed, were limited in what they could or would do. Most children had no access to regular medical care. If you collapsed at work, you were revived and returned to the line. If your foot swelled, you wrapped it in cloth and limped. And if you developed chronic conditions, asthma, rickets, joint deformities, they simply became part of your body. Pain wasn't treated. It was ignored. Unless your illness was contagious and threatened other workers, no one intervened. Every structure, every system, every authority was built to reinforce the same message. Stay in your place, do your job. Don't expect help. And that message seeped into your mind. You began to believe you deserved it, that you were weak, that you were bad, that your failures were personal, not systemic, that if you only tried harder, complained less, prayed more, things would change. But they didn't, because the institutions weren't broken. They were functioning exactly as intended, to keep you in line. When you're a child, you're supposed to dream, to imagine a world beyond your street, beyond your town, beyond the walls you live in. You're supposed to believe in something brighter, something possible. But for a child in the Industrial Revolution, even your dreams were taken from you, not just stolen, but boxed in, restrained, and molded to fit the cage of your reality. The world didn't only take your labor and your body, it took your ability to hope. From the time you could walk, your life was laid out in front of you with crushing clarity. You were told by your parents, your employers, your teachers, and your church that this was how the world worked. Poor children went to work, poor children served. Poor children didn't become masters or landowners or inventors. They became weavers, miners, errand boys, or servants. And they were lucky to have even that. To want more was considered arrogance. To speak of more was dangerous. You saw it in every adult around you. No one expected joy or fulfillment from life. They expected endurance. Your father, if he was still alive, woke up in silence and came home with nothing but ash and bruises. Your mother prayed that the roof wouldn't collapse and that there would be bread for the younger ones. No one talked about goals. No one dreamed of vacations, art, or adventure. They dreamed of survival, a loaf of bread, a week without injury, a landlord who didn't raise the rent. And you, growing up in that atmosphere, learned fast. You stopped imagining yourself as a painter or a traveler or a scholar. Maybe you didn't even know those words. You didn't fantasize about writing books or building cities. The closest thing to ambition was not dying at work. Your wildest dream was maybe, one day, becoming a supervisor, the person holding the cane instead of cowering from it. And even that felt unreachable. Most children didn't attend school. If you did, it was likely a Sunday school or a charity class that lasted only a few hours. And even those taught more about obedience than imagination. You copied letters, memorized Bible verses, learned to keep your head down. Art, music, creative writing, those weren't subjects for you. They were for the sons of bankers and doctors. Your mind was trained to follow, not to think freely. And so your inner world shrank. You dreamed only of warmth, of rest, of one meal a day that didn't come from a factory kitchen or the workhouse trough. You didn't dream of running through fields because you had never seen one. You didn't dream of oceans because you had never left the city. You didn't even dream of happiness. You dreamed of relief. Even playtime was stripped from your life. You had no toys, no time, no space. If you were small enough, you might play with pebbles or scraps during stolen minutes on a lunch break, but soon even that joy vanished beneath exhaustion. By the time you were 10, your body ached like an old man's. You didn't feel like a child anymore, and so you stopped acting like one. Society had already decided what your life would be, and it wasn't built for dreaming. If you were a girl, the best you could hope for was to become a maid in someone else's home, cleaning silver you could never own, serving meals you could never eat. If you were a boy, the best you could hope for was a strong enough back to keep hauling coal into your 20s before black lung consumed you. Even the rare bright sparks, those children who could draw, sing, or memorize poems, found their talents crushed. There was no time, no money, no support. A child with artistic skill was treated as a distraction, a daydreamer, a problem. Put that pencil down, the overseer would say, get back to work. And that was that. You learned quickly, the world did not want your ideas. It only wanted your labor. Stories and books, things that fuel a child's imagination, were largely out of reach. You couldn't afford novels, and the books that did trickle into the hands of the poor were moralistic tales about punishment, obedience, or sin. There were no heroes who looked like you. No stories where a child from your street rose up and changed the world. The message was clear. Your world would not change. You didn't deserve for it to change. Some children tried to dream anyway. They whispered hopes to one another under the blankets, shared half-remembered tales from a traveling preacher or a drunk uncle. But even then, the dream would fall apart by morning. The factory bell would ring. The cold floor would sting your feet. The soot would return to your lungs, and the dream would evaporate. And the system liked it that way. A dreaming child was dangerous. A hopeful child might question why they were being whipped. A curious child might ask why only the rich were educated. A bold child might try to leave, but a hopeless child, a broken, silent child, was manageable, cheap, predictable, easy to exploit. You didn't lose your dreams all at once. They were taken from you piece by piece, every time your body was punished for being slow. Every time you were told to shut up and obey, every time your hunger drowned out your imagination. Eventually, you stopped dreaming not because you didn't want to, but because you had forgotten how. And so, even in the few moments where your eyes closed and the machines were quiet, and your siblings slept beside you, your dreams didn't carry you upward or outward. They kept you trapped. You dreamed of the factory, of spilled coal, of broken looms, of missed quotas, of punishment. Your dreams, like your life, had been boxed in. For millions of children during the Industrial Revolution, life began quietly, and often, without any record at all. There was no birth certificate, no photograph, no hospital file. You simply existed one day, pulled into the world in a back room, a cellar, or the corner of a tenement. Maybe your mother wrote your name on a scrap of paper. Maybe a priest scribbled it into a parish ledger. But the world didn't stop to notice you. You didn't arrive into history. You slipped in through the cracks. And for most children born poor in industrial Britain, that's where you stayed. The state barely acknowledged your existence. Civil registration of births in England and Wales only became mandatory in 1874, long after the worst waves of industrial child labor had already passed through towns like Manchester, Birmingham, and Glasgow. Before that, recording a birth was often left to churches, but many parents didn't baptize their children, either because they couldn't afford the fees, or because they were too busy working, or because the child died too soon to bother. So if you were born into poverty in 1825 or 1840, it's very likely your name was never written down. You were alive, but not on paper. This was the first erasure. You were nameless in the eyes of the system. And once you started working, often at the age of 5 or 6, your body might have been noticed, but your personhood was not. Employers didn't write down your dreams, your likes, your fears. They wrote your height, your weight, your attendance. You were a line on a ledger, a dash on a schedule. Some factory records referred to child workers as small hands or numbers. Not Jack, not Mary. Not the boy with a limp or the girl who smiled. Just figures, just cost units. And if you moved, if your family was evicted, if your mother died and you were sent to live elsewhere, your records didn't follow you. There was no tracking, no documentation. You started over in a new place, just as invisible as before. There were no school files, no immunization forms, no family trees. Bureaucracy existed, but not for you. It served the landlords, the industrialists, the middle class. For you, the system was a wall with no door. Even the institutions that housed and used you, the factories, the mines, the workhouses, rarely kept consistent records. A child could die in an accident on the job, and the event might be noted in a journal or on a coroner's list, but often not by name. A small boy, age unknown. A female child crushed beneath the cart. These weren't reports of tragedy. They were cold statistics. And if your body was buried, which not everybody was, the grave was likely unmarked, shared with others, your name absent from the stone. It wasn't just that you were invisible in death. You were invisible during your life. If a journalist visited your factory and asked for a list of child workers, your overseer might list your age and job, but not your name. If a reformer took down testimony, it might be anonymous. A girl, age 10, working 14 hours a day. You were an example, a case study, a symbol, never a person, never a face. No one asked about your hobbies, your dreams, or your favorite story. No one remembered your birthday. Most children didn't know their own date of birth. The day came and went uncelebrated. There were no cakes, no candles, no gifts. Time passed by the rhythm of the factory, not the calendar. And when you got older, you didn't become a teenager. You became a bigger worker, a more productive laborer, a body growing toward exhaustion, not adulthood. What did it mean to live like that? To grow up in a world that didn't know your name? It meant that you were interchangeable, replaceable. If you fell ill and missed a shift, someone else stepped in. If you died on the job, your position was filled within the hour. If you disappeared into the street or the countryside, no one came searching. You weren't missed. You were reallocated. And this wasn't personal cruelty. It was structural. It was how the machine was built. The gears didn't pause for a broken cog. They kept turning. Some children were buried in mass graves, their names lost even to their own families. Others were never buried at all, their bodies discarded, burned, or left to decay in slums no one bothered to clean. Disease ripped through tenements and took children by the hundreds. Records, if they existed, were scrawled on parchment and forgotten in church basements. Even the census, the most basic tool of national memory, often failed to capture the youngest or the poorest. Your death wasn't recorded. Your life wasn't acknowledged. Your existence became a rumor. And the cruelest part, no one thought this was strange. It was normal. It was routine. Entire generations of children came and went, worked and died, and the world barely blinked. Reformers tried to raise the alarm, but the scale of the loss was staggering. It is estimated that tens of thousands of child laborers died from workplace injuries and illnesses between 1800 and 1870 in Britain alone. How many names do we remember? 10? Maybe 20? Out of tens of thousands? You didn't need to be famous. You didn't need to be important. You just needed to be remembered. But even that was denied to you. Because you didn't belong to history, you belonged to the gears. And today, when we speak of the Industrial Revolution, your story is still left out. We talk about James Watt, Richard Arkwright, George Stephenson, about railroads and engines and looms. But we don't talk about the 5-year-old who lost his hand in a cotton gin, the 7-year-old girl who suffocated in a chimney, the 10-year-old orphan who spent his entire life underground and died without ever seeing the sky. The story of the Industrial Revolution is told in bold headlines: innovation, steam, steel, progress. You hear about the great names, inventors, engineers, financiers, statesmen. Richard Arkwright, James Watt, Assembled Kingdom Brunel. They're painted as visionaries, as the fathers of a new age. History books celebrate the rise of the factory, the expansion of the railway, the growth of cities. You see diagrams of machinery and maps of empire. You see population curves and GDP charts. But what you don't see, what's almost always missing, is the truth about the children who built that future with their own broken bodies. The child laborer, the coughing coal hauler, the soot-choked chimney sweep, the exhausted spinner girl is rarely more than a paragraph, a photo caption, or a tragic anecdote at the end of a chapter. You don't learn their names. You don't hear their voices. You don't follow them through a day of grinding torment. They are presented as relics, curiosities, reminders of a darker time, as if they were incidental, as if they didn't shape the very foundations of modern life. But make no mistake, the Industrial Revolution didn't just happen around poor children. It happened on their backs. Factories didn't run without tiny fingers to tie threads or untangle wool. Coal mines didn't stay open without boys crawling through tunnels barely 2 feet high. Chimneys weren't cleaned without thin, terrified children scrambling up inside them and risking death by asphyxiation. Canals weren't dug without child navvies hauling rubble for 12 hours a day. Textile mills didn't function unless 10-year-old girls stood in rows, spinning spools until their joints swelled and their eyes burned. These weren't occasional workers. They were core labor. In some industries, children made up as much as 50% of the workforce. Yet history books continue to treat them as peripheral, a footnote to the narrative of progress. Why? Partly because the people who wrote the early histories of industrialization in the 19th and early 20th centuries were themselves beneficiaries of that system. Many were wealthy men, educated at elite universities, raised in households built on factory profits. Their families owned mills, mines, railroads. To center the suffering of child laborers would have meant confronting their own legacies, acknowledging that their wealth was soaked in sweat and blood. So instead, the narrative was shaped to highlight human ingenuity, technological achievement, economic growth. And to this day, many school curriculums still follow that lead. You learn about the spinning Jenny, but not the 10-year-old who lost her arm cleaning one. You study the expansion of industry, but not the thousands of children buried in unmarked graves because their deaths didn't slow production. Even when children are mentioned, the language is cold, clinical. Young laborers, juvenile workers, low-skill positions, the words strip away humanity. You don't see a frightened 8-year-old girl with blistered feet. You see a statistic, a number on a line graph, a disembodied economic factor. And that erasure has consequences, because when you don't see the child behind the machine, you don't understand the full cost of progress. You don't feel the pain that powered the Age of Steel. You don't realize that the revolution wasn't just about innovation, it was about exploitation. Systematic, institutional, and brutal. It wasn't just that children were worked, it was how they were worked. They were maimed, malnourished, degraded, and discarded. Their bones grew deformed, their spines curved, their skin turned gray with dust. They died before they reached adulthood, and when they did live, their memories were filled not with play or learning, but with punishment and exhaustion. These were the very real human costs of the Industrial Revolution. But instead of being placed at the center of that history, they were pushed to the margins. You don't read about the 8-year-old girl who never spoke again after seeing her friend crushed by a loom. You don't learn about the chimney sweep who died of testicular cancer at 16, the direct result of years of soot exposure. You don't see the names of the children who died during strikes, beaten by police for demanding shorter hours and basic safety. These are not historical rumors, these are facts. But the mainstream narratives don't include them, because they don't fit the story of progress. Even the few photographs and illustrations that exist are often sanitized. Children posed in ragged clothes, staring solemnly at the camera, but never mid-scream, never mid-collapse. The violence of their daily lives is muted. Museum exhibits might show a child's shoe or a doll found in a workhouse, but they rarely recreate the screams in the spinning room, the echo of picks in a collapsing shaft, the smell of gangrene on a crushed foot. And because of that, we forget. We forget that our cities, our wealth, our modern lives, they were built in part by children who never got to grow up. Children who never went to school, never drew a picture, never played in a field. We remember the steam engine, but not the boy who stoked its fires until his skin blistered. We remember the great inventors, but not the girls who stitched their profits together with swollen hands. We remember the progress, we forget the price. And maybe that's the most tragic thing of all, that you could suffer so much, give so much, and still be left out of the story. Because you weren't considered history, you were just part of the machinery. So now you know, the Industrial Revolution didn't just transform machines, it dismantled childhoods. It turned laughter into labor, curiosity into compliance, and dreams into dust. The children who lived through it weren't just workers. They were witnesses to a world that chose profit over protection, routine over rest, and silence over screams. And the worst part, most of them were never remembered. They came and went like cogs in the system, invisible to history, unrecorded, unnamed. But tonight, you remembered them. You listened to their stories. You walked the soot-covered streets they once limped through, breathed the air they once choked on. You stood where the textbooks never dared to linger. And maybe, just maybe, that's the beginning of something. Maybe if we remember them right, we can build a future they never had the chance to dream of. Thank you for staying with us through the shadows. If this story stayed with you, consider leaving a like or subscribing, not for us, but for the truth. Because here on Sleepless Historian, we don't close our eyes to the past. We keep it lit, even when it hurts. Now go get some rest. You've earned it. Good night, and may the forgotten never stay that way.